In St. Mary Mead, no secret stays buried.
In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a single gunshot shatters the peace, leaving Colonel Protheroe dead in the vicar's study. Was it the fiery artist Lawrence Redding, confessing to a crime of passion? Or his lover, Anne Protheroe, trapped by a tyrant's will? As alibis crumble, a hidden pistol, a Turkish cigarette, and a locked box reveal a chilling conspiracy. With Miss Marple's keen eyes and the village's whispers, secrets unravel in a tale of love, betrayal, and murder that will keep you guessing until the final clue. Chapter 1. The Unpleasant Colonel. It was one of those warm, languid afternoons in St. Mary Mead, where the sun dappled the cobblestones and the scent of roses hung heavy in the air. I, Leonard Clement, vicar of this unassuming village, sat in my study attempting to compose a sermon for Sunday. The task was proving futile, for my mind kept wandering to the vexing matter of Colonel Lucius Protheroe. The man was a thorn in the side of every soul in the parish, and tomorrow, at 6 o'clock, he would invade my study to audit the church accounts, an exercise he approached with the zeal of a general inspecting troops. Protheroe, with his bristling moustache and booming voice, was not merely unpopular, he was detested. His manor, Old Hall, loomed over the village like a stern patriarch, much like the man himself. As magistrate, churchwarden, and self-appointed arbiter of St. Mary Mead's morals, he wielded his authority with a relish that bordered on cruelty. Only last week he'd reduced Mrs. Lestrange, a newcomer, to tears over some trifling dispute about her garden fence. "The man's a bully," my wife, Griselda, had declared, tossing her dark curls. At 25, and a good deal younger than I, she had a knack for speaking truths others dared not voice. Griselda was in the drawing-room now, humming a tune and rearranging cushions with her usual disregard for order. "Len," she called, poking her head into the study, "do you think Colonel Protheroe ever smiles? I swear his face is carved from granite." I chuckled, though the thought of Protheroe's dour countenance did little to lift my spirits. "He's coming tomorrow, isn't he?" she continued, flopping onto a chair. "I suppose he'll lecture us on thrift while Mary serves him tea. Poor Mary! She'll probably drop the tray out of sheer terror." Mary, our maid, was a sturdy girl with a sullen streak, ill-suited to the delicacies of service. The prospect of her enduring Protheroe's scrutiny was grim. "I'll manage him," I said, though I lacked conviction. Protheroe had a way of making one feel like a schoolboy caught cribbing Latin. The village shared our sentiments. At the Blue Boar, where I'd stopped for a word with the sexton, the talk was all of Protheroe's latest offences. Mrs. Price Ridley, a widow with a tongue as sharp as her hatpins, had cornered me outside the post office. "That man," she hissed, "had the gall to question my contribution to the church roof fund, as if I'd shortchanged the Lord." Her indignation was echoed by others. Mr. Archer, a grizzled poacher, muttered darkly about Protheroe's threats to report him for snares. Even Miss Hartnell, a spinster of impeccable piety, confided that the Colonel's sermons on village discipline were most unchristian. Young Lettice Protheroe, the Colonel's daughter from his first marriage, was perhaps his most vocal critic. A willowy girl of 18, with a penchant for dramatic scarves and defiant remarks, she'd been seen arguing with her father in the high street. "He treats me like a child," she'd complained to Griselda, who relayed the tale with relish. Lettice's stepmother, Anne Protheroe, was a quieter figure, her elegance masking a certain unease. I'd noticed her flinch when Protheroe raised his voice at dinner last month, a small gesture that lingered in my mind. As the afternoon waned, I abandoned my sermon and stepped into the garden. The vicarage, a rambling old house, was surrounded by lawns and flower beds, tended with more enthusiasm than skill. Beyond the hedge, I glimpsed Miss Marple, our neighbour, pruning her roses. Her neat figure, clad in tweed and a straw hat, was a fixture in St. Mary Mead. She had a reputation for noticing things. Too much, some said. "Good afternoon, Mr. Clement," she called, her voice clear despite her years. "I hear Colonel Protheroe is to grace your study tomorrow. Quite an event for the parish." "An ordeal, more like," I replied, pausing at the gate. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, though her expression remained mild. "He does have a way of stirring people up," she said, snipping a wilted bloom. "But then, strong characters often do. I dare say the village will survive him." Her words were innocuous, yet I sensed a deeper meaning, as if she saw more in Protheroe's bluster than the rest of us. I returned to the house, where Dennis, my nephew, was sprawled on the sofa, reading a detective novel. At 16, he was all limbs and opinions, spending his holidays with us while his parents were abroad. "Protheroe's a beast," he announced, looking up. "I heard him shouting at Lawrence Redding in the lane yesterday. Something about his paintings being degenerate. If I were Redding, I'd have punched him." Lawrence, a young artist who'd taken a cottage in the village, was known for his charm and unconventional ways. Protheroe's disapproval was predictable. "Dennis, don't talk nonsense," I said, though I sympathised. The Colonel's quarrels were legion, and Redding was only the latest target. As I lit my pipe, I heard footsteps on the gravel outside. It was Dr. Haydock, our local physician, his ruddy face flushed from a brisk walk. "Evening, Clement," he said, stepping in. "I've just come from Old Hall. Protheroe's in a foul mood, snapped at Anne over some triviality. If he keeps it up, he'll have a stroke before I can warn him." Griselda, joining us, offered tea, which Haydock declined. "The man's impossible," he went on. "He's got half the village in a lather. I wouldn't be surprised if someone took a shot at him one day." He laughed, but the words hung in the air, sharp and unsettling. I glanced at Griselda, who raised an eyebrow. "Don't tempt fate, Doctor," she said lightly. "St. Mary, Mead's quiet, but even quiet places have their limits." As Haydock left, the evening settled over the vicarage, the sky streaked with pink and gold. I stood at the window, watching the village sink into dusk. The church spire pierced the horizon, and the cottages glowed with lamplight. Somewhere a dog barked, and the faint clatter of a bicycle carried on the breeze. St. Mary Mead seemed at peace, yet beneath its calm I felt a current of unease. Colonel Protheroe, with his domineering ways, had stirred something in our little world, something that, even then, I could not name. Chapter 2. A Shot in the Study. The evening of Colonel Protheroe's visit to the vicarage was one of those sultry summer affairs, where the air clung damply to the skin, and the promise of a storm loomed in the distance. I, Leonard Clement, had been detained at a parish meeting in the church hall, a tiresome affair involving Mrs. Price Ridley's insistence on new hymnals and Mr. Hawes, the curate, fretting over the flower rota. By the time I extricated myself, it was nearing 6:30, and I hurried along the lane to the vicarage, anxious about leaving Protheroe alone in my study. The man had a knack for finding fault, and I dreaded what he might uncover in the church ledgers, or invent, for that matter. The vicarage was quiet as I approached, its windows dark save for a faint glow from the study. The garden gate creaked under my hand, and I noted the roses, heavy with dew, nodding in the evening breeze. I entered through the front door, expecting to hear Protheroe's booming voice or the clatter of Mary in the kitchen. Instead, an eerie stillness greeted me, broken only by the tick of the hall clock. "Mary!" I called, but there was no reply. She must have stepped out to the village shop, I thought, though it was unlike her to leave without a word. I made my way to the study, the door of which stood slightly ajar. A prickle of unease ran down my spine, though I could not say why. Pushing the door open, I stopped dead. There, slumped over my desk, was Colonel Lucius Protheroe, his head resting on the blotter in a pool of dark, glistening blood. A pistol lay near his right hand, its barrel catching the lamplight. The air smelled faintly of cordite, sharp and acrid. For a moment I stood frozen, my mind refusing to grasp the scene. The clock on the desk, an old brass affair, read 6:22, its hands stark against the face. I forced myself to move, stepping closer. Protheroe's eyes were open, fixed in a glassy stare, and a single wound marred his temple. There was no mistaking it. He was dead. My heart pounded as I backed away, careful not to touch anything. I needed help, and quickly. The telephone was in the hall, and with trembling fingers I dialed Dr. Haydock's number. "Come at once," I said when he answered, my voice hoarse. "It's Protheroe. He's been shot. In my study." Haydock arrived within minutes, his medical bag in hand, his face grim as he took in the scene. "Good Lord Clement," he muttered, kneeling beside the body. He pressed a finger to Protheroe's neck, though the gesture was futile. "Dead, all right. Bullet to the head, close range. Been gone perhaps 15-20 minutes. He glanced at the pistol, his brow furrowing. "Looks like one of those service revolvers. Nasty business." I nodded, still dazed. "I must call the police," I said, and Haydock agreed. Inspector Slack, the new man at the Downshire Constabulary, was summoned, and soon the vicarage was a hive of activity. Slack was a wiry, sharp-eyed fellow with a manner that suggested he trusted no one. He surveyed the study with a hawkish gaze, barking orders to a young constable who fumbled with a notebook. "Time of death?" he snapped at Haydock. "Between 6 and 6:30, I'd say," Haydock replied. "Can't be more precise without a proper examination." Slack's eyes fell on the clock. 6:22, he said, almost to himself. "Oddly specific. You find him like this, Vicar?" "Yes," I said. "I came home from a meeting, and there he was." I recounted my movements, mentioning the empty house and Mary's absence. Slack's questions were relentless. Had I heard a shot? Seen anyone near the vicarage? Touched the gun? I answered as best I could, though my thoughts were scattered. Mary, who had returned just as the police arrived, was questioned next. She stood in the doorway, her apron twisted in, her hands, her usual sullenness replaced by wide-eyed alarm. "I didn't hear nothing, sir," she insisted. I was in the kitchen till about 6. Then I popped out to get some butter from Mrs. Baker's. When I got back, the vicar was calling for the doctor." She hesitated, then added, "I did see Mr. Redding, though, earlier. He came through the garden gate, maybe 6:15. Looked in a hurry." "Redding?" Slack's interest sharpened. "The artist chap. What was he doing here?" "Dunno, sir," Mary said. "He went to the study, I think. Didn't stay long." Slack made a note, his expression unreadable. I recalled Lawrence Redding's recent clash with Protheroe, the one Dennis had mentioned. Could it have escalated to this? The thought was absurd, yet the pistol gleamed accusingly on the desk. As the police cordoned off the study, I stepped into the garden for air. The village was stirring now, lights flickering in cottage windows as news of the murder spread like wildfire. Across the hedge, I saw a familiar figure, Miss Marple, standing in her garden, her pruning shears idle in her hand. She wore a shawl against the evening chill, and her eyes, keen and unblinking, met mine. "A dreadful thing, Mr. Clement," she said softly. "Poor Colonel Protheroe. To think it happened here, in your home." I nodded, unsure what to say. Miss Marple's gaze drifted to the vicarage, where the constable stood guard. "They'll be asking questions, I suppose," she said, "about who was where and when. People do get so muddled about times, don't they?" Her tone was gentle, but there was a weight to her words, as if she were already sifting through the village's secrets. "They've mentioned Lawrence Redding," I said, unable to stop myself. "Mary saw him." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Did she now? Well, Mr. Redding's a spirited young man, not one to take kindly to Protheroe's ways." She paused, then added, "But a pistol, Mr. Clement. That's a deliberate choice, isn't it? Not a spur-of-the-moment act." I shivered, though the night was warm. The storm I'd sensed earlier was closer now, a low rumble echoing beyond the hills. As I returned to the vicarage, where Griselda was waiting, pale but composed, I couldn't shake Miss Marple's words. The study, with its blood-stained blotter and ticking clock, held more than a body. It held a story, one I feared would unravel St. Mary Mead itself. Chapter 3. The Village Whispers. The morning after Colonel Protheroe's murder dawned with a deceptive brightness, the sun casting long shadows across St. Mary Mead's cobblestone lanes. The vicarage, however, felt cloaked in gloom, its familiar, rooms tainted by the memory of blood on the study floor. I, Leonard Clement, had slept fitfully, haunted by the image of Protheroe's lifeless form, and the relentless ticking of that brass clock, frozen at 6:22. Griselda, usually buoyant even in the face of trouble, was subdued as she poured tea in the dining room. "The village will be unbearable today," she said, her voice low. "They'll talk of nothing but the murder." She was right. St. Mary Mead thrived on gossip, and a scandal of this magnitude was like kindling to a bonfire. By the time I stepped outside to clear my head, the air was thick with whispers. The postman, dawdling by the church gate, nodded grimly. "Bad business, Vicar," he said. "Never thought I'd see the day. Murder in St. Mary Mead." His tone held a mix of horror and relish, as if the event, while shocking, lent a certain thrill to his rounds. I made my way to the high street, hoping a walk might steady my nerves. The village was a picture of rural charm. Thatched cottages with geraniums spilling from window boxes, the ancient yew tree guarding the churchyard, the Blue Boar's sign creaking in the breeze. Yet beneath this idyll, a current of unease ran, strong. At the grocer's, Mrs. Baker was holding court, her apron dusted with flour, as she recounted the news to a cluster of women. Shot he was, right in the vicar's study. They say Mr. Redding was seen leaving just before. Always thought that artist had a wild streak. I slipped past, unwilling to be drawn in, but the words followed me. Lawrence Redding's name was on every tongue. His brief visit to the vicarage now inflated into a damning clue. I recalled the young man's easy charm, his dark eyes flashing with defiance when Protheroe had criticised his modernist paintings. Could such a quarrel have led to murder? The idea seemed preposterous, yet the pistol in the study, so coldly efficient, suggested a calculated act. My steps took me to the church, where I found Mr. Hawes, the curate, polishing the brass lectern with unnecessary vigour. A nervous man, prone to bouts of ill health, he started at my approach. "Oh, Mr. Clement, I heard about the Colonel. Dreadful, simply dreadful." His hands trembled, and I wondered if it was merely the shock or something more. Hawes had clashed with Protheroe over parish matters, the Colonel's domineering ways grating on his fragile temperament. "Were you at the vicarage yesterday?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. No, he said quickly. "I was here preparing for evensong. I saw no one, well, except Mrs. Lestrange, perhaps, passing by the lich gate around 5. His mention of the newcomer piqued my interest. Mrs. Lestrange, a striking woman with a guarded manner, had arrived in St. Mary Mead some weeks ago, taking a cottage near the woods. Her aloofness had sparked curiosity, and Protheroe's public rebuke of her had only fuelled the village's fascination. I made a mental note to ask Miss Marple about her. If anyone had observed Mrs. Lestrange's habits, it would be she. Leaving Hawes to his polishing, I continued my walk, the village's chatter enveloping me like a fog. At the post office, Miss Weatherby, a spinster with a penchant for lurid novels, was sorting letters with exaggerated care. "They say the Colonel was shot at close range," she confided, her eyes gleaming. "And that clock stopped at 6:22, wasn't it? I wonder if it means something." Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "Mrs. Price Ridley claims she heard the shot, you know. At 6:20, clear as day. This was new." Mrs. Price Ridley, a widow of formidable presence, was not one to let a detail pass unembellished, but her proximity to the vicarage made her claim worth noting. Her garden shared a boundary with ours, separated only by a low stone wall and a row of laurels. I thanked Miss Weatherby and moved on, resolving to speak to Mrs. Price Ridley myself. If she had indeed heard a shot, it could narrow the time of death, and perhaps point to the killer's movements. My next encounter was with Lettice Protheroe, whom I spotted near the village green, her blonde hair loose and her scarf trailing like a banner. She was feeding crumbs to a flock of sparrows, her expression distant. "Good morning, Lettice," I said, approaching cautiously. The girl had always struck me as flighty, more interested in dances and novels than her father's rigid world. Today, though, there was a brittleness to her, as if the murder had stripped away her usual nonchalance. "Oh, Vicar," she said, brushing her hands. "I suppose you've heard. Everyone has." Her voice was light, but her eyes flickered with something, grief, perhaps, or defiance. Father was always making enemies. He couldn't help it, really. He'd argue with anyone, me, Anne, even that artist fellow, Redding. She paused, tossing her scarf over one shoulder. I was at the tennis courts yesterday, miles away. Didn't hear a thing until I got home. Her alibi was offered almost too readily, and I wondered if she felt the need to account for herself. It must be a shock, I said gently. If there's anything Griselda or I can do. You're kind, she interrupted, but I'm fine, really. She turned back to the sparrows, dismissing me with a vague smile. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the sense that Lettice was hiding something. Not guilt, perhaps, but a secret she wasn't ready to share. The village's pulse quickened as the day wore on. By noon, a small crowd had gathered outside the Blue Boar, where Inspector Slack's motorcar was parked. The inspector himself emerged, his sharp features set in a scowl, as he fended off questions from curious onlookers. I caught his eye and nodded, but he brushed past, clearly in no mood for pleasantries. His investigation, I knew, would focus on the vicarage and those who had been near it. Lawrence Redding, chief among them. I decided to call on Mrs. Price Ridley, whose cottage stood at the end of the lane. Her parlour was a shrine to Victorian clutter, with antimacassars on every chair and a stuffed owl glowering from a shelf. She received me with her usual air of command, her black silk dress rustling as she gestured me to a seat. "Mr. Clement, this is a disgrace," she began, her voice carrying the weight of moral authority. "A murder in the vicarage. I told the inspector. I heard the shot myself, 20 minutes past 6, as I was tending my roses." "Indeed?" I said, leaning forward. "You're certain of the time?" "As certain as I stand here," she declared. I checked my watch, for I was expecting a delivery from the butcher. A single shot, sharp and clear, from the direction of your garden. Her eyes narrowed. "I told my maid, Clara, to note it, but the girl's half-deaf and claims she heard nothing. Typical." This discrepancy intrigued me. Mrs. Price Ridley was not above exaggeration, but her insistence on the time suggested she believed her account. "Did you see anyone near the vicarage?" I asked. "Not a soul," she said, then hesitated. "Though, now I think of it, I did notice that Mrs. Lestrange walking toward the woods earlier, perhaps at 6. She's a queer one, keeping to herself. And Anne Protheroe, too. I saw her in the lane, though she was gone by the time the shot rang out. Anne Protheroe. The Colonel's widow had been a shadow in the village's talk thus far. Her grief, or lack of it, yet to be scrutinized. I thanked Mrs. Price Ridley and took my leave, her parting words ringing in my ears. "Mark my words, Vicar, this is no random act. Someone wanted that man dead." My next stop was the Manor, Old Hall, where Anne Protheroe was receiving callers. The house was a sombre pile of grey stone, its windows draped in mourning black. A maid ushered me into the drawing-room, where Anne sat, composed and pale, her dark hair swept into a neat chignon. She wore a simple grey dress, her only adornment, a pearl brooch. "Mr. Clement," she said, rising, "how kind of you to come. This is a difficult time." Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed a slight tremor as she gestured to a chair. I offered my condolences, studying her closely. Anne was perhaps 35, with a refined beauty that contrasted with Protheroe's bluster. Their marriage, by all accounts, had been strained, his domineering nature clashing with her quiet reserve. "I was walking in the woods yesterday," she said, unprompted. "I often do to clear my mind. I returned home after 6, only to learn of—" What happened? Her alibi, like lettuces, came too smoothly, and I wondered if she'd rehearsed it. "The village is in shock," I said. "They're saying Lawrence Redding was at the vicarage." Her expression flickered, a momentary tightening of her lips. "So I've heard," she said. "Lawrence is impulsive, but surely not—" She broke off, her gaze drifting to the window. "Lucius had many enemies, Mr. Clement. He was not an easy man." The admission hung between us, heavy with unspoken truths. I left soon after, my mind turning over her words. Anne's composure was admirable, but was it the calm of innocence, or something more calculated? Back at the vicarage, Griselda was entertaining Miss Marple, who had called with a basket of early plums. The two were an odd pair. Griselda, vibrant and irreverent, and Miss Marple, prim and perceptive, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically. "The village is positively buzzing," Griselda said, offering me a plum. "They've all but convicted poor Lawrence." Miss Marple looked up, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. "Poor Lawrence, indeed," she said. "But people are quick to judge, aren't they? Stories have a way of twisting, especially when they're told and retold." She set her knitting aside, folding her hands. "Mrs. Price Ridley's shot, for instance, most intriguing. If she heard it at 6:20, and Dr. Haydock places the death between 6 and 6:30, one wonders about the timing." "You think she's mistaken?" I asked. "Not necessarily," Miss Marple said, "but people hear what they expect to hear. A loud noise, a bang, it needn't be a pistol. And that clock, Mr. Clement, stopped so precisely. Clocks don't stop themselves, do they?" Her tone was mild, but her words carried a quiet authority. "As for Mr. Redding, his visit to the vicarage is convenient, isn't it? Almost too convenient." Griselda leaned forward, her eyes alight. "You think someone's trying to make him look guilty?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that people's stories rarely align perfectly, especially when they're hiding something. Take Mrs. Protheroe's walk, or Miss Lettuce's tennis, or even Mrs. Lestrange's stroll by the lich gate. Everyone accounts for themselves, yet the pieces don't quite fit." I stared at her, struck by the clarity of her insight. Miss Marple, with her unassuming air and village anecdotes, saw St. Mary Mead as a tapestry of motives and misdirections. "What do you suggest?" I asked. "Observe," she said simply. "Listen to what's said, and what isn't. The truth is there, Mr. Clement, in the little things people overlook." As she gathered her basket and took her leave, I felt a sigh, stirring of hope. The village's whispers, chaotic and accusing, were a puzzle, but Miss Marple's quiet logic offered a thread to follow. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting St. Mary Mead in a golden haze. The murder had shattered our peace, but perhaps, with time and care, we might unravel its secrets and lay Colonel Protheroe's ghost to rest. Chapter 4. The Artist's Confession. The third day after Colonel Protheroe's murder brought a restless energy to St. Mary Mead, as if the village itself were straining under the weight of suspicion. The vicarage, once a haven of quiet routine, now felt like a stage where grim events unfolded. I, Leonard Clement, woke to the sound of rain pattering against the windows. A steady drizzle that mirrored the unease in my heart. Griselda, ever resilient, was in the dining room, coaxing Mary to serve breakfast without spilling the tea. "The village is positively feverish," she remarked, buttering her toast. "They're all waiting for Inspector Slack to pounce." She was not wrong. The murder had ignited St. Mary Mead's imagination, and Lawrence Redding, with his fleeting visit to the vicarage, remained the focal point of every whispered theory. I'd seen him only yesterday striding through the high street, his dark hair damp from the mist, his expression one of barely contained agitation. The village had already cast him as the villain, but I could not reconcile the young artist's charm with the cold precision of that pistol shot. Yet Mary's account of his presence, coupled with his public quarrel with Protheroe, hung over him like a storm cloud. My morning duties took me to the church, where I hoped to find solace in the familiar tasks of parish life. The nave was cool and dim, its stained glass windows casting muted colours across the pews. Mr. Hawes, the curate, was there, arranging hymnals with his usual nervous energy. "Any news, Vicar?" he asked, his voice high and strained. "The police were at the Blue Boar last night, asking about Redding. They say he had a motive." "Gossip," I said, more sharply than I intended. "We mustn't judge until the facts are clear." Hawes nodded, but his eyes darted to the door, as if expecting Inspector Slack to materialize. I left him to his work, my thoughts turning to the investigation. Slack's methodical approach was relentless, but I sensed he was grasping at the most obvious thread, Lawrence, without considering the tangle of motives that Protheroe's domineering nature had woven. As I stepped into the churchyard, I was hailed by Dr. Haydock, who was crossing the lane, his medical bag swinging at his side. "Clement," he called, his ruddy face flushed from the damp. "You've heard the latest, I presume. Redding's gone and confessed. Marched into the police station this morning and declared himself the killer." I stopped short, the rain chilling my neck. "Confessed? Lawrence Redding?" The words felt unreal, like a line from one of Griselda's detective novels. Haydock nodded, wiping his brow. "Bold as brass, they say. Claims he shot Protheroe in a fit of rage and left the pistol behind. Slacks over the moon, thinks he's cracked the case. But why confess now?" I asked, my mind racing. "He's had days to come forward." Haydock shrugged. "Guilt, perhaps? Or he's protecting someone." Either way, it stirred the village up. Mrs. Price Ridley's already planning a petition to keep murderers out of St. Mary Mead. He chuckled, but his eyes were grave. "I'd have a word with Slack if I were you. That confession sounds too neat for my liking." I thanked him and hurried toward the police station, a small brick building near the village green. The rain had thickened, turning the lanes to mud, and I arrived damp and dishevelled. Inspector Slack was in the front room, barking orders to a constable who scribbled furiously. "Vicar," he said, glancing up, "come to gawk at the drama." "I've heard about Redding," I said, ignoring his tone. "Is it true? He's confessed?" Slack leaned back, his sharp eyes glinting. "True enough. Walked in at 9 o'clock, pale as a ghost, and said he did it. Shot Protheroe with his own pistol. He claims, after a row about his paintings. Says he lost his temper, fired and ran. Dropped the gun in a panic." He tapped a sheaf of papers. "We're holding him for questioning. The pistol's being tested, but it's his all right. Service revolver, registered in his name." I frowned, the details jarring. "What time?" Does he say it happened?" "Around 6:15, Slack said. "Fits with Mary's sighting and the clock at 6:22. He claims no one saw him leave because he went through the garden gate, not the front." He smirked, clearly pleased with the tidy narrative. Motive, opportunity, and now a confession. Open and shut, if you ask me. But I was not so sure. Lawrence's story, so perfectly aligned with the evidence, felt rehearsed, as if he were reciting a script. "May I see him?" I asked. Slack hesitated, then shrugged. 5 minutes. He's in the back." He led me to a small bare room where Lawrence sat, his hands clasped on a wooden table. He looked haggard, his usual vitality drained, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. "Vicar," he said, managing a weak smile, "come to offer absolution." "I've come to understand," I said, taking the chair opposite. "Lawrence, why confess? If it's true, why wait until now?" He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling. "Because it's true," he said. "I couldn't stand Protheroe. He called my work degenerate, threatened to ruin me. I went to the vicarage to confront him, and things got out of hand. I had my pistol, and before I knew it—" He trailed off, staring at the table. "I didn't mean to kill him. It just happened." His words were earnest, yet they lacked conviction, as if he were persuading himself as much as me. "You left the pistol behind?" I pressed, "and set the clock to 6:22? He blinked, startled. "The clock? I didn't touch it. I fired, and ran. Must have been around 6:15. I don't know about any clock." His confusion seemed genuine, and I felt a spark of doubt. The clock, so deliberately stopped, was a detail that nagged at me, a piece that didn't fit his impulsive narrative. Our time was cut short by Slack's knock, and I left Lawrence with a promise to return. As I stepped into the rain, my mind churned. A confession should have clarified things, yet it only deepened the mystery. Why would Lawrence admit to murder, but falter on the clock? And why confess at all, when he might have escaped suspicion? I decided to seek Miss Marple's counsel. Her cottage, a neat affair with climbing roses, was a short walk from the vicarage. She was in her parlour, knitting a pale blue shawl, her eyes bright with interest as I recounted Lawrence's confession. "Most curious," she said, her needles pausing. "He's awfully eager to be guilty, isn't he? And yet that pistol left so conveniently. It's almost theatrical. You think he's lying?" I asked, settling into a chintz-covered chair. "Not lying, perhaps," she said, "but not telling the whole truth. A confession can be a shield, Mr. Clement, as much as a surrender. He may be protecting someone, or deflecting attention." She tilted her head, her expression thoughtful. "That clock bothers me. If Mr. Redding didn't touch it, someone else did. And Mrs. Price Ridley's shot at 6:20. Could it have been something else? A distraction, perhaps?" Her words echoed my own unease. "Dr. Haydock thinks the confession is too neat," I said, and Lawrence seemed uncertain about the details. "People often are when they're inventing," Miss Marple said, "or when they're covering for another. I've seen it in the village before. Old Mrs. Finch, for instance, who swore she'd broken her own vase to spare her nephew's blushes. Human nature, Mr. Clement, is remarkably consistent." She resumed her knitting, the needles clicking like a metronome. "Have you spoken to Mrs. Protheroe lately? Or Miss Lettice? Their reactions might tell us something." I admitted I hadn't, though Anne's composed demeanour at Old Hall lingered in my mind, as did Lettuce's airy detachment. I saw Anne glance at Lawrence's name in the village shop yesterday, I said. She looked nervous, I thought. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. Did she now? A small thing, but small things matter. Mrs. Protheroe's a private woman, but even private, people have their weaknesses. And Miss Lettuce, such a modern girl, always flitting about. I wonder if she's as carefree as she seems. Our conversation was interrupted by Griselda, who burst in, her umbrella dripping. "Len, you'll never guess," she said, breathless. "Mrs. Lestrange was seen arguing with Protheroe last week, near her cottage. Miss Hartnell swears she heard raised voices, something about interference. And now the village thinks she's involved." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Mrs. Lestrange is proving quite the enigma," she said. "A woman who keeps to herself always attracts notice in a place like St. Mary Mead. But an argument is not a murder, Mrs. Clement." Griselda flopped onto the sofa, undeterred. "Still, it's suspicious. And with Lawrence confessing, everyone's in a tizzy. Mrs. Baker says he's covering for a lover. How romantic." "Romantic, perhaps," Miss Marple said dryly, "but impractical. Murder is rarely so poetic." She turned to me. "Mr. Clement, I suggest you keep an eye on the manor. Mrs. Protheroe and Miss Lettuce may not speak freely, but their actions will. And Mr. Redding, his confession may unravel if pressed. The truth, you see, is like a loose thread. Pull gently, and the whole fabric comes apart." I left her cottage with a renewed sense of purpose. The rain now a soft mist that veiled the village in grey. My next stop was Old Hall, where I hoped to gauge Anne's response to Lawrence's confession. The manor's heavy oak door was opened by a maid, who led me to the drawing-room. Anne was there, seated by a fire that did little to warm the room's chill. She looked weary, her grey dress accentuating the pallor of her skin. "Mr. Clement," she said, rising, "I've heard about Lawrence. It's unthinkable." "Is it?" I asked, watching her closely. "He says he acted in anger over a quarrel with your husband." Her hands tightened in her lap, the knuckles whitening. "Lucius could be provoking," she said, "but to kill him, Lawrence is not that sort of man." Her voice wavered, and I sensed a flicker of something, fear, perhaps, or loyalty. "I was in the woods when it happened," she added, as if to forestall further questions. "I saw no one, heard nothing." Her insistence on her alibi was familiar, and I pressed gently. "The village is talking, Mrs. Protheroe. They say Lawrence might have had other reasons, personal ones." Her eyes met mine, sharp and guarded. "Gossip is cruel," she said. "Lawrence and I were acquaintances, nothing more. He painted my portrait once, but that was all." The denial was swift, but her composure faltered, a crack in her polished façade. I left Old Hall with more questions than answers, Anne's reaction adding to the puzzle. The village was alive with speculation, and I overheard fragments as I passed the Blue Boar. "Redding's protecting someone, mark my words. That Mrs. Lestrange knows more than she lets on. Protheroe's will, there's the key." The last comment from old Mr. Archer lingered. Protheroe's wealth was substantial, tied up in trusts and estates. Who stood to gain from his death? Back at the vicarage, I found Griselda in the hall, sorting letters. Any luck with Anne? She asked, her eyes bright with curiosity. She's shaken, I said, but guarded. And Lawrence's confession doesn't sit right. He's too vague about the clock, and Miss Marple thinks he's shielding someone. Griselda's face lit up. A conspiracy! Oh, Len, it's like a novel. Perhaps Anne and Lawrence were in love, and they planned it together. Her imagination, as ever, outpaced reason, but I couldn't dismiss the possibility entirely. Anne's glance in the shop, her quick defence of Lawrence. They hinted at a connection deeper than she admitted. As evening fell, the rain ceased, leaving St. Mary Mead cloaked in a damp hush. I stood at the study window, the room now cleared of its grim evidence, but still heavy with memory. Lawrence's confession had shifted the investigation, yet it felt like a misstep, a bold move that obscured rather than revealed. Miss Marple's words echoed, "The truth is in the little things." I resolved to watch and listen, to trace the threads of motive and opportunity that wound through our quiet village. Somewhere, in the glances and silences of St. Mary Mead, lay the key to Protheroe's death, and I was determined to find it. Chapter 5. The Vicarage Intruder. The fourth day following Colonel Protheroe's murder dawned with a deceptive calm, the kind that settles over St. Mary Mead when the village is poised between shock and speculation. The vicarage, though cleansed of the physical traces of that grim evening, remained a place of unease. I, Leonard Clement, found myself avoiding the study, its once familiar confines now tainted by the memory of blood and betrayal. Griselda, ever the optimist, was determined to restore normalcy, bustling about with plans for a parish tea. "We can't let a murder stop us living," she declared, pinning her hair with a flourish. "Besides, the village needs something to talk about besides poor Lawrence." Lawrence Redding's confession had electrified St. Mary Mead, but doubts lingered, fueled by Miss Marple's quiet scepticism and my own misgivings. His story, impulsive rage, a dropped pistol, clashed with the deliberate precision of the stopped clock and the absence of a clear shot heard by anyone but Mrs. Price Ridley. Inspector Slack, however, was triumphant, convinced he had his man. As I sipped my morning tea, I resolved to uncover more, to probe the edges of this puzzle that refused to align. My thoughts were interrupted by Mary, who entered the dining room with a tray and a scowl. "Sir," she said, setting down the toast with a clatter, "there's something queer you ought to know. Last night, after you and the missus went to bed, I heard a noise at the back door, like someone trying the handle." I set down my cup, startled. "The back door? Are you sure?" "Sure as I'm standing here," she said, folding her arms. "I was in the kitchen, tidying up, when I heard it. Soft, like they didn't want to be noticed. I looked out, but it was dark, and I didn't see nobody. This morning, though, I found the pantry window unlatched. Nothing's gone, far as I can tell, but it gave me the creeps." Griselda, who had joined us, raised an eyebrow. "An intruder? In the vicarage? Oh, Mary, this is positively thrilling. Perhaps it's the murderer coming back for evidence." Mary sniffed, unimpressed. "Thrilling or not, I don't like it. You ought to tell that Inspector Slack, sir. He's always poking." "About," I agreed, though I suspected Slack would dismiss it as trivial. The idea of an intruder, however, was unsettling. The vicarage had been the scene of a crime. Could someone have returned, seeking something left behind? A clue, perhaps, or an item that might incriminate them. I made a note to inspect the pantry myself and headed to the police station, where I found Slack in his office, surrounded by reports. "An intruder?" he said when I relayed Mary's story. His tone was sceptical, his sharp eyes narrowing. Probably a tramp, or one of those village lads up to mischief. "We've got our man, Vicar. Redding's confession seals it. No need to invent ghosts." "But the window was unlatched," I persisted, "and nothing was taken. Doesn't that strike you as odd?" Slack shrugged, his attention already back to his papers. "Odd, maybe, but not my priority. Redding's pistol matches the bullet, and his story holds. If you're so keen, check the vicarage yourself. But don't expect me to chase shadows." His dismissal was infuriating, but I held my tongue. Slack's focus on Lawrence blinded him to other possibilities, and I was determined to explore them. Returning to the vicarage, I examined the pantry. The window, a small casement overlooking the garden, was indeed unlatched, its catch loose but undamaged. The sill was damp from last night's rain, but I saw no footprints or signs of forced entry. The back door, too, was intact, its lock unmarred. Whatever had happened, it was subtle. A cautious intrusion, not a burglary. I stood in the garden, the air heavy with the scent of wet earth, and scanned the path that led to the lane. A low hedge separated us from Miss Marple's cottage, and I wondered if her keen eyes had noticed anything unusual. I decided to consult her at once. Miss Marple was in her garden, tending to a bed of chrysanthemums, her straw hat tilted against the morning sun. "Mr. Clement," she said, straightening, "you look troubled. Is it the investigation, or something new?" I recounted Mary's story, watching her face for a reaction. Her expression remained mild, but her eyes sharpened. "An intruder," she murmured, brushing soil from her gloves. "Most intriguing. And nothing taken, you say? That suggests they were looking for something specific, something they didn't want found. Like what?" I asked. "The police searched the study thoroughly." "Did they?" she said, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Police are thorough, but they often miss the obvious. A letter, perhaps, or a trinket. Something small enough to overlook but dangerous to the killer. The study was the scene, after all. And that unlatched window, such a quiet way to enter." She paused, her gaze drifting to the vicarage. "I wonder if they succeeded, or if they'll try again." Her words sent a chill through me. The idea of an unseen figure creeping through the vicarage was unnerving. Yet it fit the pattern of calculation that marked Protheroe's death. "You think it's connected to the murder?" I asked. "I think," she said, "that murders leave ripples. People act out of fear, or guilt, or desperation. This intruder, Mr. Clement, is one such ripple. Keep your eyes open, and your doors locked." Her tone was gentle, but her warning was clear. I left her to her flowers and returned to the village, my mind buzzing. The intruder's purpose eluded me, but Miss Marple's suggestion of a hidden item, a letter, perhaps, nagged at my thoughts. Protheroe had been a man of secrets. His control over St. Mary Mead rooted in his knowledge of its undercurrents. Could he have possessed something, a document, a threat, that prompted his murder? My next destination was the Blue Boar, where I hoped to glean the village's latest theories. The pub was a hub of gossip, its low ceilings and smoky air fostering confidences. As I entered, I was greeted by a chorus of nods and murmurs. Old Mr. Archer, nursing a pint, waved me over. "Vicar," he said, his voice rough with tobacco, "they're saying Redding's confession's shaky. Word is, the police ain't so sure now." I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Shaky?" Inspector Slack seemed convinced. Archer chuckled. "Slack's a bulldog, but even he's got doubts. I heard from the barman, Redding can't say why the clock was stopped, and he's vague on where he went after. Plus, there's talk of another gun. Protheroe had enemies, Vicar, and not just artists." The mention of another gun was new, and I pressed for details, but Archer had none. His words, though, echoed Miss Marple's scepticism, and I wondered if Slack's case was less solid than he claimed. I bought a lemonade and lingered, catching snippets of conversation. Mrs. Baker, delivering bread to the bar, was adamant. "Redding's too pretty to be a killer. I reckon it's that Mrs. Lestrange, always skulking about." Another voice, Miss Weatherby's, chimed in. "Or Anne Protheroe. She's too calm if you ask me. No widow should be that composed." Anne's name surfaced again when I visited the post office, where Miss Hartnell was sorting parcels. "Mrs. Protheroe was in yesterday," she confided, her voice low. "Buying stamps, cool as you please, but I saw her hands shake when she mentioned Lawrence Redding. There's something between them, Vicar, mark my words." The village's suspicions were coalescing around Anne, her reserve interpreted as guilt. I recalled her guarded demeanour at Old Hall, her quick defence of Lawrence. Was it loyalty, or something deeper? I decided to call on her, hoping to gauge her reaction to the intruder and the shifting case against Lawrence. Old Hall was quiet, its mourning drapes lending an air of sombre dignity. Anne received me in the library, a grand room lined with leather-bound, volumes that Protheroe had likely never read. She wore black today, her pearl brooch replaced by a jet pin, and her face was drawn as if sleep had eluded her. "Mr. Clement," she said, offering a faint smile, "you're kind to keep visiting. The village is unkind just now." "They're shaken," I said, choosing my words carefully. "A murder unsettles people. And now, with this business of an intruder at the vicarage." "An intruder?" Her eyes widened, a flicker of alarm breaking her composure. "When? What happened?" I described Mary's account, watching her closely. "Last night, someone tried the back door and left, a window unlatched. Nothing was taken, but it's troubling, given what happened in the study." She pressed a hand to her throat, her fingers trembling. "That's dreadful. Do the police know?" "They do, though Inspector Slack thinks it's unrelated. I'm not so sure." I paused, then added, "The village is talking, Mrs. Protheroe, about Lawrence's confession and other matters. They say you knew him well." Her expression hardened, though her voice remained steady. "Lawrence is a friend," she said. "He painted my portrait, as I told you. The village loves its stories, but they're just that, stories." She rose, signalling the end of the conversation. "I'm sorry, Mr. Clement, but I'm unwell today. Please excuse me." Her dismissal was polite but firm, and I left with a sense of having touched a nerve. Anne's reaction to the intruder was genuine fear, but her defence of Lawrence felt rehearsed, a shield against prying eyes. As I walked down the Manors drive, I spotted Lettice Protheroe in the garden, pruning roses with a pair of shears. She looked up, her scarf slipping from her shoulder. "Vicar," she called, waving. "Come to console the grieving daughter." Her tone was mocking, but her eyes were red-rimmed, suggesting tears shed in private. "I came to see your stepmother," I said. "She's upset about the intruder at the vicarage." Lettuce snorted, snipping a stem with unnecessary force. "An intruder? How Gothic! Probably some nosy villager hoping to find a bloody glove." She tossed her hair, her nonchalance brittle. "Anne's taking it all so seriously, isn't she? Always so proper, even now father's gone." "You don't seem convinced by her grief," I said, probing gently. She shrugged. "Anne's Anne. She hated father's rules as much as I did, but she played the dutiful wife. Now she's free, and I'm stuck here until the will's sorted." Her words carried a hint of resentment, and I wondered if Lettuce knew more about Anne's feelings than she let on. "Free?" I echoed. "That's an odd way to put it." Lettuce smirked. "Isn't it, though? Father controlled everything, money, us, the village. Without him, things change. For Anne, for me, for everyone." She turned back to the roses, dismissing me with a flick of her shears. Her words lingered as I returned to the vicarage, where Griselda was planning her tea with a zeal that bordered on mania. "We'll have scones," she declared, "and I've invited Miss Marple. She'll keep the gossips in line." I smiled, grateful for her energy, but my thoughts were elsewhere. Lettuce's hint at Anne's freedom, coupled with the intruder's silent visit, suggested a motive tied to Protheroe's control, perhaps his wealth, or a secret he'd held over someone. That evening, I called on Miss Marple again, finding her in her parlour, a tray of tea and biscuits at her elbow. She listened to my account of Anne, Lettuce, and the village's rumours, her expression one of quiet absorption. "An intruder is a bold move," she said, pouring me a cup. "They risked discovery, which means their need was urgent. As for Mrs. Protheroe, her fear is telling. She knows something, Mr. Clement, even if she won't say it." "And Lettuce?" I asked. "She seems to resent Anne. Miss Lettuce is young," Miss Marple said, "and young people feel slights keenly. She may sense her stepmother's secrets, or she may simply dislike sharing the spotlight. But Mrs. Protheroe and Mr. Redding, there's a thread there, I think. Not love, necessarily, but a shared purpose." She sipped her tea, her eyes distant. "The intruder, the confession, the stopped Addis clock, they're all pieces of the same puzzle. Keep watching, Mr. Clement. The village will tell us what we need to know." As I walked home through the dusk, St. Mary Mead was hushed, its cottages glowing with lamplight. The intruder's shadow loomed large, a reminder that Protheroe's murder was not a single act, but a web of intentions, woven through the village's heart. I locked the vicarage doors that night, but sleep came slowly. My dreams filled with unlatched windows and the echo of a shot that no one heard. Chapter 6. The Clock's Discrepancy. The 5th day after Colonel Protheroe's murder brought a shift in St. Mary Mead's atmosphere, as if the village, exhausted by its frenzy of speculation, had settled into a wary vigilance. The vicarage, though still a focal point of whispered theories, was slowly reclaiming its role as my home, albeit one shadowed by recent events. I, Leonard Clement, found myself drawn to the study despite my reluctance, compelled to confront the scene that had upended our quiet lives. The room was tidy now, the blood-stained blotter replaced, the pistol long since taken by Inspector Slack's men. Yet the brass clock on the desk, its hands frozen at 6:22, haunted me, a silent witness to a crime that refused to yield its secrets. Griselda, sensing my unease, was in high spirits, determined to distract us both. "Len," she called from the hall, where she was arranging flowers with more enthusiasm than skill. "You must stop brooding. The parish tea is tomorrow, and I've persuaded Miss Marple to bring her lemon drizzle cake. That'll cheer everyone up." Her optimism was infectious, but my thoughts were elsewhere, tangled in the threads of Lawrence Redding's confession, the mysterious intruder, and the nagging question of what or who had stopped that clock. Lawrence's admission, so bold and yet so riddled with gaps, had begun to fray under scrutiny. His uncertainty about the clock, coupled with Miss Marple's suggestion that he might be shielding someone, kept me circling back to the study. I sat at the desk staring at the clock, its gilt frame gleaming in the morning light. It was an old piece, reliable despite its age, and I had wound it myself the day before Protheroe's visit. Why then had it stopped? And why at 6:22? Time that seemed to anchor the murder in a way that felt too precise. I decided to test it. Fetching a small key from the drawer, I wound the mechanism and set the hands to noon. The clock ticked steadily, its rhythm unbroken. I let it run for an hour, watching as it kept perfect time. This was no mechanical failure. Someone had deliberately halted it, perhaps to mislead us about the moment of death. The realization sent a shiver through me, for it suggested a mind far more calculating than Lawrence's impulsive narrative implied. I needed perspective, and there was no one better than Miss Marple to provide it. Her cottage was a short walk, and I found her in her sitting room, a tray of tea and shortbread biscuits before her. She greeted me with her usual warmth, though her eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, missed nothing. "Mr. Clement," she said, pouring me a cup, "you have the look of a man wrestling with a puzzle. Is it the investigation or something new?" I described my experiment with the clock, watching her face for a reaction. Her expression remained serene, but a spark of delight lit her eyes. "A deliberate clue," she said, setting her cup down. "How fascinating! That clock was stopped to fix the time of death in our minds. 6:22, a moment that suits someone's story. But whose? Not Mr. Redding's, I think, since he seemed unaware of it." "Exactly," I said, leaning forward. "Lawrence claims he fired in a rage and fled, yet the clock suggests planning. And Dr. Haydock's estimate between 6:15 and 6:30 means the shot could have been earlier or later. The clock narrows it, but falsely, I suspect." Miss Marple nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of her saucer. "A false narrowing, yes. It's like a stage prop, meant to focus our attention. But it raises questions. Who had access to the study? Who knew the clock's habits? And why choose 6:22 specifically?" She paused, her gaze distant. "I wonder about Mrs. Price Ridley's shot at 6:20. Her garden is so close to the vicarage. One might hear all sorts of noises. She's a forceful woman, but not always accurate. You think she mistook the sound?" I asked, recalling the widow's insistence. "Not mistook, perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but misinterpreted. A loud noise, a bang, a crack, could be many things. A firecracker, for instance, or a branch snapping. People hear what they expect, especially in a village where excitement is rare." Her tone was mild, but her words carried weight, suggesting a layer of deception I hadn't considered. I left her cottage with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to revisit the study and its surroundings. The vicarage garden, with its winding paths and dense shrubbery, offered ample cover for someone moving unseen. I walked the route from the back door to the study window, noting how the laurel hedge screened the view from Mrs. Price Ridley's cottage. A noise here, a deliberate distraction perhaps, could easily be mistaken for a shot, especially by someone primed for drama. My inspection was interrupted by Dennis, my nephew, who bounded out of the house, his schoolboy energy undimmed by the village's gloom. "Uncle Len," he called, brandishing a cricket bat. "Heard you were playing detective. Found anything juicy?" I smiled, ruffling his hair. "Only questions, I'm afraid. Tell me, Dennis, did you notice anything odd the evening of the murder? You were in the garden, weren't you?" He shrugged, swinging the bat. "Not really. I was kicking a ball about till Griselda called me in for supper, around 6. Saw Redding leave, though. Looked like he was in a strop. And there was a funny noise, come to think of it. Like a pop, over by the hedge. I thought it was a car backfiring." Bo's heart quickened. "A pop? What time was this?" "Dunno," he said, squinting. "Maybe 6:10. I wasn't watching the clock." His casual remark was a revelation, aligning with Mrs. Price Ridley's shot, but suggesting something less lethal. A firecracker, as Miss Marple had posited, could explain it. A ruse to confuse the timeline. I sent Dennis back to his game and returned to the study, my mind racing. The clock, the noise, the intruder, all pointed to a carefully staged crime, one that relied on misdirection. But who had the cunning to orchestrate it? Lawrence's confession, already suspect, seemed even less credible now. I needed to speak, to him, to press him on the details he'd omitted. The police station was bustling when I arrived, with constables sorting files and Slack barking orders. Lawrence was still in custody, though Slack informed me, with a hint of irritation, that the case was not as tidy as it looked. The pistol, while registered to Lawrence, bore only smudged prints, and his account of fleeing through the garden was unverified. "He's sticking to his story," Slack said, "but it's thin. You can have 10 minutes. Lawrence was in the same bare room, his face gaunt, his hands restless. "Vicar," he said, managing a wry smile. "Back to save my soul." "I'm here about the clock," I said, sitting opposite. "You said you didn't touch it, yet it stopped at 6:22. If you shot Protheroe at 6:15, as you claim, who set it?" He frowned, his fingers drumming the table. "I told you, I don't know. I was in a panic, shot him, dropped the gun, and ran. Maybe it stopped on its own." His voice was defiant, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty, as if the clock's roll unsettled him, and the noise in the garden. I pressed. "A pop around 6:10. Did you hear it?" He shook his head. "Nothing. I was arguing with Protheroe then. It happened. I didn't notice any pops." His denial was firm, but I sensed he was holding back, his confession a wall that hid something or someone else. I left the station with a growing conviction that Lawrence was not the mastermind. His story was too ragged, his ignorance of the clock and the noise too genuine. But if not him, then who? Anne Protheroe's guarded demeanour came to mind, as did Lettice's cryptic remarks about her stepmother's freedom, and Mrs. Lestrange, the village's enigma, remained a shadow in the narrative, her argument with Protheroe a tantalizing clue. My next stop was Old Hall, where I hoped to probe Anne's reaction to the latest developments. The manor was hushed, its heavy curtains drawn against the midday sun. A maid ushered me to the morning room, where Anne sat, a book unopened in her lap. She looked fragile, her black dress accentuating the shadows under her eyes. "Mr. Clement," she said, rising, "you're a frequent visitor. Is there news?" I mentioned the clock's discrepancy, watching her closely. "It seems someone tampered with it to fix the time of death, and there's talk of a noise in the Vicarage garden. A pop, not a shot. It's complicating Lawrence's confession." Her lips parted, a flicker of surprise crossing her face. "A noise? I didn't hear anything. I was in the woods, as I said." Her hands twisted in her lap, and I sensed she was grappling with something unsaid. "Lawrence's confession, is it in doubt?" "The police are questioning it," I said. "The clock, the noise, they don't fit his story. Some think he's protecting someone." Her gaze dropped, her fingers tightening on the book. "Protecting someone? That's absurd. Lawrence is reckless, but not noble." Her voice was sharp, almost bitter, and I wondered at the emotion behind it. Was it fear for Lawrence, or fear of what he might reveal? I left Old Hall with a sense of having glimpsed a crack in Anne's armour, though its meaning eluded me. The village was alive with activity as I walked back, its residents tending gardens or chatting over fences, their eyes following me with curiosity. At the grocer's, Mrs. Baker cornered me, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "They're saying Redding's confession's falling apart," she said, "and Miss Lettice was seen at the station, talking to that constable. What's she up to, eh? Lettice at the police station?" This was unexpected, and I resolved to find her. I spotted her near the village green, lounging on a bench with a cigarette, her scarf a vivid splash of red. "Vicar," she said, exhaling, a plume of smoke. "Come to scold me for smoking?" "I heard you were at the police station," I said, sitting beside her. "Is everything all right?" She laughed, a brittle sound. "Oh, that. I was just curious. Wanted to know what they're saying about Lawrence. He's in a mess, isn't he? Father always said he was trouble." Her nonchalance was forced, and I sensed she was fishing for information. "Did you tell them anything?" I asked. "Nothing worth telling," she said, flicking ash. "I was at the tennis courts, like I said. But I did overhear Anne and Father arguing the day before he died. Something about money and her foolish notions." She was furious, more than I've ever seen. Her eyes gleamed with mischief, as if she enjoyed stirring the pot. The argument was new, and I filed it away, wondering if it tied to Anne's unease. As I rose to leave, Lettice added, "You know, Vicar, Father kept a locked box in his study. At home, papers, he said. Maybe you should ask Anne about it." Her tone was casual, but her words were a spark, igniting fresh possibilities. Back at the vicarage, I shared my findings with Griselda, who was arranging teacups for the parish event. "A locked box!" she exclaimed, her eyes alight. "Len, this is straight out of a thriller. What if it's a will or a blackmail letter? You must tell Miss Marple." I did just that, calling on Miss Marple as evening fell. She was in her garden, clipping lavender, her movements precise despite the fading light. I recounted the clock's test, Dennis's pop, Anne's reaction, and Lettice's hint about the box. She listened, her face a study in concentration. A locked box, she said, setting her shears down. "That's most suggestive. Colonel Protheroe was a man who held power over others, through money or secrets. If Mrs. Protheroe quarrelled with him, it may point to motive." "And the clock?" I asked. "The noise! The clock is a lie," she said firmly. "It was stopped to mislead us, to make us trust the 6:22 timestamp. The noise, your nephew's pop, may have been a diversion, to draw attention at the wrong moment. Someone planned this, Mr. Clement, and they knew the village's habits. Mrs. Price Ridley's ear, the vicarage's quiet. They used it all." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "Mrs. Protheroe's fear interests me. She's hiding something, and Mr. Redding's confession may be part of it. Watch them both, and that box, if it exists." As I walked home, the village was cloaked in twilight, its lamps casting pools of light on the wet cobblestones, the clock's discrepancy, the garden's pop, the locked box. They were pieces of a mosaic, each revealing a glimpse of the truth. St. Mary Mead, with its gossip and glances, was a stage for deception, and I felt the weight of its secrets pressing closer. Tomorrow's parish tea, with its gathering of villagers, would be a chance to observe, to listen, as Miss Marple urged, to the silences that spoke louder than words. Chapter 7. The Alibi. Unraveled. The 6th day since Colonel Protheroe's murder dawned with a crisp clarity, the kind of morning that made St. Mary Mead's cottages gleam like illustrations in a storybook. Yet beneath this serene façade, the village simmered with suspicion, its residents dissecting every glance and rumour with relish. The vicarage, though bustling with preparations for Griselda's parish tea, felt like a house under siege, its walls echoing with the memory of that fatal shot. I, Leonard Clement, woke with a sense of urgency. The threads of the investigation, Lawrence Redding's faltering confession, the stopped clock, the mysterious intruder, and Lettice's hint of a locked box, twisting in my mind like a knot I could not untie. Griselda was in the dining room, orchestrating Mary's efforts with a tray of sandwiches. "Len," she said, catching my eye, "you're brooding again. If you don't smile at the tea, Mrs. Price Ridley will accuse you of hiding the murderer yourself." Her teasing was a balm, but my thoughts were elsewhere, fixed on Anne Protheroe's guarded demeanour and the possibility that her alibi, so smoothly offered, might not hold. The parish tea was set for 3 o'clock, a gathering that promised to draw the village's key players, Anne, Lettice, Miss Marple, and perhaps even Mrs. Lestrange, whose elusive presence continued to spark curiosity. I hoped the event would offer a chance to observe, to catch the unguarded moments that Miss Marple so often cited as the key to truth. But first, I needed to test a new lead, one that had surfaced unexpectedly the previous evening. Old Mr. Archer, the poacher, had stopped me outside the Blue Boar, his weathered face alight with mischief. "Vicar," he'd said, leaning close, "I was in the woods the day Protheroe died, checking my snares. Saw Mrs. Protheroe, I did, near the vicarage gate, not deep in the forest like she claims. Must have been 6:10, maybe earlier." His words, delivered with a sly grin, were a bombshell. Anne had insisted she was walking in the woods, far from the vicarage, at the time of the murder. If Archer was right, her alibi was a lie, and her proximity to the crime scene damning. Decided to confront her, but tactfully, knowing her reserve could harden under pressure. First, though, I visited the vicarage garden, drawn by Miss Marple's suggestion that the pop Dennis heard might have been a diversion. The laurel hedge, thick and glossy, bordered Mrs. Price Ridley's property, and I examined the ground beneath it, searching for traces of a firecracker or other device. The earth was soft from recent rain, but I found nothing. No charred remnants, no telltale scraps, yet the idea of a staged noise lingered, a clever trick to mislead the village about the shot's timing. My inspection was cut short by Dennis, who emerged from the house, a cricket ball in hand. "Uncle Len," he said, tossing it idly, "you're at it again, aren't you? Griselda says you're turning into Sherlock Holmes." His grin was infectious, but I seized the chance to probe further. "Dennis," I said, "that pop you heard in the garden, can you describe it? Was it loud, like a gun, or sharper?" He squinted, thinking. "Sharp, I'd say. Like when we set off bangers at school. Not a boom, more a crack. I didn't think much of it, thought it was kids messing about." His description strengthened my suspicion of a firecracker, a ploy that required foresight and access to the vicarage grounds. I thanked him and headed to Old Hall, determined to test Anne's story. The manor's gravel drive crunched underfoot, and the air was heavy with the scent of late roses. A maid ushered me to the drawing-room, where Anne sat, a letter in her hand. She wore a navy dress today, her hair pinned with quiet elegance, but her eyes betrayed a weariness that no composure could mask. "Mr. Clement," she said, folding the letter, "you're very diligent. Is this about the investigation?" I nodded, choosing my words with care. "Mrs. Protheroe, there's been a development. Someone saw you near the vicarage gate around 6:10 on the evening of the murder. Not in the woods, as you've said. Can you clarify where you were?" Her face paled, the letter slipping from her fingers. For a moment she was silent, her hands clenching in her lap. "Who said this?" she asked, her voice low. "A villager," I replied, keeping Archer's name out of it. "They're certain of the time. It places you much closer to the vicarage than you've claimed." She rose, moving to the window, her back to me. I may have been mistaken," she said at last. "I was walking, yes, but I did pass near the vicarage gate briefly, to cut through to the lane. I didn't enter the grounds, and I certainly didn't see Lucius." She turned, her eyes meeting mine. "I was back in the woods by 6:15 alone. You must believe me, Mr. Clement." Her admission was a crack in her alibi, but her insistence on solitude felt rehearsed, like a line she'd prepared for just such a challenge. "Did you see anyone else?" I asked. "Lawrence Redding, perhaps?" Her lips tightened, a flicker of alarm crossing her face. "No," she said. "I saw no one. Lawrence he's told the police his story, hasn't he?" Her deflection was subtle, but it confirmed my suspicion that Lawrence's confession weighed heavily on her. I left Old Hall with a sense of progress, though Anne's partial confession raised more questions than it answered. Why had she lied about her route? And why the quick denial of seeing Lawrence? The village's gossip, with its hints of a connection between them, seemed less fanciful now, though I couldn't yet discern its shape. The parish tea was in full swing when I returned to the vicarage, the lawn dotted with tables and villagers in their Sunday best. Griselda was a whirlwind, charming Mrs. Price Ridley into silence, and coaxing Miss Hartnell to share her jam recipe. Miss Marple was there, seated beneath an oak, her knitting in her lap, and a plate of her promised lemon drizzle cake before her. She beckoned me over, her eyes twinkling. "Mr. Clement," she said, "you've been busy, I see. Any new pieces to our puzzle?" I recounted Anne's revised alibi and Archer's sighting, keeping my voice low to avoid eavesdroppers. Miss Marple listened, her needles pausing. "Most revealing," she said. "Mrs. Protheroe's change of story suggests she's afraid of being placed too near the crime. But her fear may not be of guilt, you know. She could be protecting someone or shielding a secret." "Like Lawrence?" I asked, thinking of her reaction to his name. "Possibly," she said. "Or something else entirely. A woman like Mrs. Protheroe, married to a man like the Colonel, would have learned to keep secrets. And that locked box Miss Lettice mentioned, have you pursued it?" "Not yet," I admitted. "Anne's not likely to volunteer it." Miss Marple smiled. "No, but servants talk, Mr. Clement. A discreet word with the maid at Old Hall might yield something. And keep an eye on Miss Lettice today. She's a restless creature, and restless creatures often let things slip." Her advice was sound, and I scanned the crowd for Lettice. She was near the tea-table, laughing with Dennis, her red scarf a vivid contrast to her pale dress. I approached, catching her as she reached for a scone. "Lettice," I said, "you mentioned a locked box in your father's study. Have you seen it since his death?" She froze, her hand hovering over the plate. "The box? Oh, that. It's still there, I suppose. Anne's taken over father's study, but she's not touched his things. Why do you ask?" Her tone was casual, but her eyes darted to the house as if gauging the distance to Old Hall. "It might hold papers relevant to the case," I said. "Your father was a man of influence. Perhaps he kept records, debts, agreements." She smirked, brushing crumbs from her fingers. "Records? Father kept everything under lock and key, especially from me. Said I'd fritter his fortune away. If there's anything juicy, Anne's probably got it now." Her words carried a hint of spite, and I wondered at the tension between her and her stepmother. Before I could press further, Griselda called Lettice to help with the tea-urn, and I returned to Miss Marple, who was now chatting with Miss Weatherby. The spinster was in full flow, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "They say Lawrence Redding's confession is crumbling," she said, "and Mrs. Protheroe was seen near the vicarage. Imagine! I always thought she was too polished, that one." Miss Marple's expression remained bland, but her eyes flicked to me, a silent acknowledgment of the village's relentless churn. I excused myself and mingled, catching fragments of conversation. Mrs. Baker's theory that the intruder was after Protheroe's will, Mr. Hawes's nervous assertion that he'd been in the church all evening, Mrs. Price Ridley's insistence that her shot was proof of a conspiracy. Each snippet was a piece of the mosaic, but none brought clarity. As the tea wound down, I noticed Anne's absence. Griselda, catching my glance, whispered, "She sent word she was unwell. Poor thing, the village is tearing her apart." I nodded, but my thoughts were on Anne's fear, her lie about the woods, and the locked box that might hold the key to her secrets. Determined to follow Miss Marple's advice, I slipped away to Old Hall, hoping to speak to the maid. The manor was quiet, its windows dark, save for a glow in the study. The maid, a young girl named Elsie, answered the door, her apron crisp but her eyes wary. "Mrs. Protheroe's resting, sir," she said, Can I help you?" I smiled, keeping my tone light. "Just a quick question, Elsie. Miss Lettice mentioned a locked box in the Colonel's study. Have you seen it moved or opened since his death?" She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. I don't know, sir. Mrs. Protheroe's been in the study, sorting papers, but she keeps it locked when she's not there. There's a box on the desk, though, brass, with a funny lock. I've not seen it open." Her voice dropped. "She's been jumpy, sir, ever since the murder. Snaps at me for nothing." I thanked her and left, Elsie's words adding weight to Lettice's hint. A brass box, untouched but guarded. Could it hold a will, a letter, or something more incriminating? Anne's behaviour, her revised alibi, and her tension around Lawrence suggested she was entangled in the crime. If not as the killer, then as a keeper of secrets. Back at the vicarage, I found Griselda clearing away the tea things. Her face flushed with success. "A triumph, Len," she said. Even Mrs. Price Ridley complimented the scones. "Did you learn anything?" I recounted my day. Anne's lie, the locked box, Elsie's observations. Griselda's eyes widened. "A secret box? Len, you must get into that study. What if it's a confession or a threat?" Her enthusiasm was contagious, but I urged caution, knowing Anne's wariness would make any intrusion difficult. That evening, I called on Miss Marple, finding her in her parlour, a fire crackling in the grate. She listened to my account, her knitting needles still. "Mrs. Protheroe's alibi unravels," she said, "and the box emerges. This is progress, Mr. Clement. The box may hold the motive, money, power, or a secret that Protheroe used to control others. And Mrs. Protheroe's fear. She's not just afraid of discovery, but of what others might do with the truth." "What others?" I asked, leaning forward. She smiled, a glint of mischief in her eyes. "Mr. Redding, perhaps. Their stories are intertwined, you see. His confession protects her, or tries to, but it's clumsy. And Miss Lettice, she knows, more than she says. She's watching her stepmother, waiting for a misstep." She set her knitting aside. "The clock, the noise, the box, they're all part of a performance, Mr. Clement. Someone staged this murder to look one way, while the truth lies elsewhere. Keep pressing and watch the manner. The answers are there, in the silences." I walked home. The village was cloaked in darkness, its lamps flickering like eyes in the night. Anne's unravelling alibi, the locked box, the staged noise. They pointed to a crime of calculation, one that used St. Mary Mead's rhythms to conceal its heart. I locked the vicarage doors, but sleep was elusive. My dreams filled with ticking clocks and a brass box that held the key to a village's secrets. Chapter 8. The gossip's truth, the 7th day since Colonel Protheroe's murder, draped St. Mary Mead in a restless haze, the village caught between the thrill of scandal and the dread of an unsolved crime. The vicarage, though bustling with Griselda's efforts to maintain normalcy, felt like a stage where unseen actors played out their secrets. I, Leonard Clement, woke with a sense of disquiet. The threads of the investigation, Anne Protheroe's crumbling alibi, the locked box, the staged clock, and the intruder's shadow, weaving a pattern I could almost grasp. Lawrence Redding's confession, now riddled with doubts, hung over the village like a storm cloud, and the gossip that fueled St. Mary Mead's pulse was reaching a fever pitch. Griselda was in the dining room, sorting invitations for a charity bazaar. her dark curls, escaping their pins. "Len," she said, glancing up, "the village is positively rabid. Mrs. Baker swears Anne and Lawrence were lovers, and Miss Weatherby's convinced Mrs. Lestrange is hiding a criminal past. You must do something before they start burning effigies." Her tone was playful, but her eyes held a flicker of concern, mirroring my own unease. The gossip, though often exaggerated, had a way of circling the truth, and I resolved to sift through it, separating fact from fancy. Anne's admission that she'd been near the Vicarage gate, not deep in the woods, had cast doubt on her story, and Lettuce's hint about a locked box suggested a motive tied to Protheroe's control, perhaps financial, perhaps personal. But it was the village's whispers about Anne and Lawrence, their supposed romance, that demanded attention. If true, it could explain Lawrence's confession and Anne's fear, tying them to the murder in a way that felt both tragic and plausible. My morning began with a visit to the church, where I hoped to clear my mind amid the quiet of the nave. The stained glass windows cast jewelled light across the pews, and the air was cool, scented with wax and old wood. Mr. Hawes, the curate, was there, polishing the altar rail with his usual nervous energy. "Vicar," he said, starting at my approach, "the village is in a state. They're saying Mrs. Protheroe was seen with Redding before the murder. It's unseemly." "Gossip travels fast," I replied, studying him. Hawes's anxiety seemed heightened, his hands trembling as he worked. "Have you heard anything specific about Mrs. Protheroe or the day of the murder?" He shook his head too quickly. "Nothing, sir. I was here preparing for evensong, as I told you, though—" He hesitated, his eyes darting to the door. "I did see Mrs. Protheroe in the lane earlier that day. She looked distressed, I thought, but I didn't speak to her." His admission, though vague, added to the picture of Anne's unease, and I wondered what had troubled her before her husband's death. Leaving Hawes to his polishing, I stepped into the churchyard, where the yew tree cast a long shadow. My thoughts turned to Mrs. Price Ridley, whose claim of hearing a shot at 6:20 had been a cornerstone of the timeline, until Miss Marple suggested it might have been a firecracker. Her cottage was nearby, and I decided to press her for details, hoping to clarify the noise's nature. The garden path to her door was lined with dahlias, their colours vivid against the grey stone. She received me in her parlour, a room cluttered with china shepherdesses and faded photographs, her black silk dress rustling as she gestured me to a chair. "Mr. Clement," she began, her voice carrying the weight of authority, "this murder is a stain on St. Mary Mead. And now, to hear that Mrs. Protheroe and that artist were carrying on, it's disgraceful." Her indignation was palpable, and I seized the opening. "You've heard about Anne and Lawrence, then?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. "What exactly did you see?" She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. "See, Mr. Clement? I saw them with my own eyes 3 days before the murder, in the woods near my cottage. They were walking close, heads together, like conspirators. I told my maid, Clara, it was improper, but she's no sense for scandal. And then, the day of the murder, I heard that shot, 6:20, as I told the inspector. It came from your garden, I'm sure of it." Her certainty was unshaken, but her mention of the woods was new, a concrete sighting that lent weight to the rumours. "Clara didn't hear the shot, though." I asked, recalling her earlier contradiction. Mrs. Price Ridley sniffed. Clara's. Useless. She was in the kitchen clattering pots. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. Mrs. Protheroe and Redding are at the heart of this, mark my words. Her conviction was fierce, but I sensed a touch of embellishment, a desire to star in the village's drama. I thanked her and left, her words echoing in my mind. A romantic link between Anne and Lawrence, if true, could explain their mutual protection. His confession, her guarded silences. But Mrs. Price Ridley's shot remained a puzzle, its timing too convenient for a crime that relied on misdirection. I resolved to revisit the vicarage garden, to search again for traces of a firecracker or other device that might have tricked her ear. The garden was quiet, the laurel hedge glistening with morning dew. I knelt by the path near the study window, sifting through the soil for anything out of place. My fingers brushed something small and hard, a fragment of paper singed at the edge, half buried in the dirt. It was no more than an inch square, but its charred texture suggested a firecracker's wrapper, discarded in haste. My heart quickened. This was no coincidence. Someone had set off a noise to mimic a shot, aligning with Dennis's pop and Mrs. Price Ridley's claim to anchor the murder at 6:20, while the real shot occurred elsewhere or earlier. I pocketed the fragment and headed to Miss Marple's cottage, eager to share my find. She was in her sitting room, a tray of tea and ginger biscuits before her, her knitting a soft blue heap in her lap. "Mr. Clement," she said, her eyes bright, "you've found something, haven't you? Your face gives you away." I showed her the paper, describing its discovery and Mrs. Price Ridley's account of Anne and Lawrence in the woods. She examined the fragment, her fingers delicate but sure. "A firecracker, I'd wager," she said, handing it back. "Clever, very clever. They used the village's habits, Mrs. Price Ridley's watchful eye, the vicarage's quiet, to stage a false shot. And this sighting of Mrs. Protheroe and Mr. Redding, it's more than gossip, I think. They're bound together, not just by affection, but by intent. You believe they planned the murder?" I asked, settling into a chair. "Not alone, perhaps," she said, pouring tea. "But their alibis are too neat, too dependent on each other. Mr. Redding says he left before the shot. Mrs. Protheroe says she was absent. Yet both were near the vicarage, and both are lying about something. A conspiracy, Mr. Clement, requires trust and timing. They've misjudged the village, though. People notice too much." Her voice was calm, but her words carried a quiet certainty, as if she saw the puzzle's shape, where I saw only pieces. "What about the locked box?" I asked, thinking of Lettice's hint and Elsie's confirmation. "Could it hold proof of their motive?" "Very likely," she said. "Colonel Protheroe was a man who wielded secrets like weapons. A box, brass, locked, guarded by Mrs. Protheroe, might contain a will, a debt, or something more personal. You must find a way to see it, Mr. Clement, though discreetly. Mrs. Protheroe is wary, and with reason." She paused, her eyes narrowing. "I suggest you check the vicarage garden path again, near the gate. If someone planted that firecracker, they may have left another trace, a footprint, a cigarette end. The little things you see tell the story." Her advice was a beacon, and I left her cottage with a plan. The vicarage garden path, leading from the gate to the study, was a likely route for whoever had set the firecracker. I returned home and walked the path, the gravel crunching underfoot, the hedge casting dappled shadows. Near the gate, where the path met the lane, I noticed a patch of disturbed earth, as if someone had scuffed the ground. Kneeling, I found a cigarette stub, its tip crushed but intact, half hidden beneath a leaf. It was not a common brand. Turkish, I thought, with a faint scent of spice. Lawrence smoked English cigarettes, I recalled, but Anne had been seen with exotic ones at a village fete. Could this be hers? The find was a spark, igniting new questions. If Anne had been at the gate, as Archer claimed, could she have planted the firecracker, then slipped away to maintain her alibi? Or was someone else involved, using the noise to obscure the real shot? I pocketed the stub, determined to show it to Miss Marple later, and headed to the Blue Boar, where the village's gossip might yield further clues. The pub was crowded, its air thick with tobacco and ale. Old Mr. Archer was at his usual table, his pint half drunk, his eyes gleaming with news. "Vicar," he said, waving me over, "they're saying Redding's confessions got holes big enough to drive a cart through. And Mrs. Protheroe, she's been seen with him again, whispering in the churchyard yesterday. Bold as brass, if you ask me." "Yesterday?" I asked, startled. "After his confession?" "Aye," he said, leaning close. "Miss Hartnell saw 'em near the yew tree, looking like they didn't want to be noticed. She reckons they're in it together, lovers, plotting to get rid of the Colonel." His words, though tinged with relish, aligned with Mrs. Price Ridley's sighting, building a case that was hard to dismiss. I bought a lemonade and lingered, catching fragments of talk. Mrs. Baker's claim that Anne had inherited a fortune. Miss Weatherby's theory that Mrs. Lestrange was a spy. Mr. Hawes's nervous mutterings about suspicious strangers near the church. The village was a cauldron of suspicion, and Anne and Lawrence were at its centre, their every move scrutinised. Determined to test Archer's story, I sought out Miss Hartnell, finding her at the post office, sorting letters with her usual efficiency. "Mr. Clement," she said, peering over her glasses, "I suppose you've heard about Mrs. Protheroe and Redding. I saw them myself in the churchyard yesterday evening. They were arguing, I think, hushed but tense." She touched his arm, like she was pleading. "It's not right with her husband barely cold." Her account was vivid, and I pressed for details. "Did you hear what they said?" "Not clearly," she admitted. "Something about keeping quiet and no choice. I didn't stay, didn't want to be caught eavesdropping. But it's clear they're hiding something, Vicar." Her disapproval was palpable, and I thanked her, my mind racing. Argument after Lawrence's confession suggested panic, a plan unravelling under pressure. Back at the vicarage, Griselda was in the hall, arranging bizarre flyers. "Any luck, Len?" she asked, her eyes bright. "The village is buzzing about Anne and Lawrence. Mrs. Baker says they were engaged before Anne married Protheroe. Imagine!" "More gossip," I said, though the idea lingered. A past romance could explain their closeness, and a rekindled one could provide a motive. I showed Griselda the cigarette stub, describing its discovery and the firecracker fragment. Her face lit up. "A Turkish cigarette! Len, that's Anne's brand. I saw her with them at the fete. She's the key, isn't she?" "Perhaps," I said, urging caution, "but we need proof, not theories." I resolved to confront Anne again, this time about the cigarette and her churchyard meeting with Lawrence. Old Hall was my next stop, but I found the manor locked, a note on the door stating that Anne was visiting a friend in a neighbouring village. The timing felt convenient, as if she were avoiding scrutiny. Instead, I sought Lettice, hoping her candour might shed light. She was at the village green, sketching the church with a pencil and pad, her scarf trailing in the grass. "Vicar," she said, not looking up, "you're like a bloodhound. What's it now?" "I heard you were at the police station," I said, sitting beside her. "And now there's talk of Anne and Lawrence in the churchyard. What do you know, Lettice?" She smirked, shading the church spire. "Anne and Lawrence? Old news. They've been cosy for ages. Father hated it, called Lawrence a penniless dauber. As for the police, I just wanted to stir things up. Anne's so smug, acting the grieving widow. I bet she's glad Father's gone." Her bitterness was raw, and I sensed a deeper grudge. "Did your father know about them?" I asked. "Oh, yes," she said, her pencil pausing. "He threatened to cut Anne off if she didn't behave. That's why she stayed, I think. Money. Father's will's a mess, though. I heard the lawyer say it's tied up in trusts and Anne gets most of it. Lucky her." Her tone was acid, and I wondered if her resentment masked envy or knowledge. I left her to her sketch, her words adding fuel to the fire. Anne's inheritance, her past with Lawrence, the locked box, they pointed to a motive rooted in freedom and wealth. That evening, I returned to Miss Marple, finding her in her parlour, a fire casting shadows on the walls. I shared the cigarette stub, the churchyard sighting, and Lettice's revelations, watching her face for insight. "A Turkish cigarette," she said, examining the stub. "Mrs. Protheroe's, I'd wager. She was at the gate, setting the firecracker, creating the illusion of a shot. And her meeting with Mr. Redding. They're frightened, Mr. Clement. Their plan, whatever it was, is fraying. The box, the will, the gossip, it's all closing in." She set her knitting aside, her eyes piercing. "They're protecting each other, but not cleverly. The village sees too much. Press Mrs. Protheroe if you can, and watch Miss Lettice. She's playing her own game." As I walked home, St. Mary Mead was hushed, its cottages dark against the starry sky. The gossip, once a cacophony, was crystallizing into truth. Anne and Lawrence, bound by love or conspiracy, had orchestrated a crime that the village's watchful eyes were unravelling. The cigarette stub, the locked box, the churchyard whispers, they were clues to a murder staged with care, but betrayed by the human flaws Miss Marple so keenly understood. Tomorrow I would find Anne, and the truth, I hoped, would finally emerge. Chapter 9. The Second Weapon. The 8th day following Colonel Protheroe's murder cloaked St. Mary Mead in a deceptive calm, the village's fervour simmering beneath a surface of routine. The vicarage, though restored to order by Griselda's determined cheer, remained a place of echoes, each creak of the floorboards recalling the night of the crime. I, Leonard Clement, woke with a restless energy. The investigation's threads, Anne Protheroe's faltering alibi, the locked box, the firecracker's charred remnant, and the Turkish cigarette stub, coalescing into a pattern that felt tantalizingly close to revelation. Lawrence Redding's confession, now widely doubted, had frayed under the village's scrutiny, and the gossip linking him to Anne was no longer mere speculation, but a beacon pointing to motive. Griselda was in the drawing, room sorting linens for the charity bazaar, her hands busy, but her mind clearly elsewhere. "Len," she said, folding a tablecloth with unnecessary force, "the village is practically vibrating. Mrs. Baker swears Anne's planning to flee to France, and Miss Hartnell claims Lawrence is writing a tell-all memoir from his cell. You do. Must find the truth before they start accusing poor Mary of poisoning the tea." Her exaggeration was playful, but her concern mirrored my own. The village's imagination, unchecked, was weaving a narrative that could obscure the facts. My morning began with a resolve to confront Anne about the cigarette stub and her churchyard meeting with Lawrence. But a new development upended my plans. As I stepped into the garden, intending to re-examine the path where I'd found the stub, I was hailed by Constable Hurst, a young officer with an earnest demeanour. "Vicar," he called, hurrying down the lane. "Inspector Slack sent me. We've found something in the vicarage shrubbery. A second pistol, hidden under the rhododendrons. He wants you at the station." A second pistol. The news struck like a thunderbolt, shattering the case's fragile framework. I followed Hurst to the police station, my mind racing. Lawrence's confession had hinged on his service revolver, found beside Protheroe's body, its bullet matching the fatal wound. A second weapon suggested a twist that could unravel everything. Proof, perhaps, that the crime was not a spontaneous act, but a meticulously staged deception. The station was a hive of activity, with constables sorting evidence and Slack pacing like a caged hound. He greeted me with a curt nod, his sharp eyes glinting with a mix of triumph and frustration. "Vicar," he said, gesturing to a table where a cloth-wrapped bundle lay. "Take a look. Found this morning, buried in the mulch near your study. Window. Identical to Redding's revolver, down to the make and caliber." He unwrapped the cloth, revealing a gleaming pistol, its barrel clean but its grip smudged with dirt. "We've sent it for testing," he continued, "but I'd wager my badge it's the real murder weapon. The one in the study was a plant, meant to point us at Redding. His confession's a sham, and we've been played." His admission of error was grudging, but it confirmed what Miss Marple and I had suspected. The crime was a performance, its props carefully chosen to mislead. "How was it found?" I asked, studying the weapon. "Pure luck," Slack said. "A gardener was trimming your shrubs and spotted it, wrapped in oilcloth, tucked deep. Whoever hid it didn't expect it to be found, not yet anyway." He rubbed his chin, his expression darkening. "This changes everything. Redding's story doesn't hold, and we're back to square one. Any ideas, Vicar? You're always poking about." I hesitated, then mentioned the cigarette stub and the firecracker fragment, careful not to reveal Miss Marple's role. "Someone staged a noise to mimic a shot," I said. Mrs. Price Ridley's shot at 6:20 was likely a firecracker set off to fix the timeline, and the cigarette, Turkish, possibly Mrs. Protheroe's, places her near the gate. Slack's eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Protheroe, eh? Her story's been shaky from the start, and Redding's protecting her, I'll bet. Lovers, just like the village says. I'll have her in for questioning." His eagerness was palpable, but I urged caution, knowing Anne's reserve could harden under pressure. I left the station with a sense of vertigo, the second pistol reshaping the case like a kaleidoscope. If the study's gun was a decoy, the killer had fired elsewhere, perhaps in the garden or even outside the vicarage, then staged the scene with the clock and the planted revolver, the firecracker, the cigarette, Anne's proximity. They pointed to a conspiracy, one that leveraged St. Mary Mead's rhythms to conceal its truth. Determined to share the news, I headed to Miss Marple's cottage, finding her in her garden, tying up dahlias with twine. Her straw hat shaded her eyes, but her smile was keen as she greeted me. "Mr. Clement," she said, brushing soil from her hands. "You bring tidings, I see. Something momentous, by your expression." I recounted the pistol's discovery, watching her face for a reaction, her eyes lit with a quiet satisfaction, as if a piece of her puzzle had slotted into place. "A second weapon," she murmured, leading me to her sitting room. "How deliciously clever." The study's gun was a decoy, meant to ensnare Mr. Redding, while the real one was hidden, perhaps for later retrieval. The killer, or killers, thought themselves safe, but they underestimated the village's eyes. She poured tea, her movements deliberate, and gestured to a plate of almond biscuits. "This confirms our suspicions," she continued. "The murder was staged, clock, gun, noise, all to create a false narrative. Mrs. Price Ridley's shot was your firecracker set to confuse the time, and the cigarette stub, Mrs. Protheroe's, I presume, places her at the heart of it. She and Mr. Redding are entangled, Mr. Clement, not just by sentiment, but by design. You think they acted together?" I asked, sipping the tea. "I think," she said, "that their alibis are a dance, each step covering the others. Mr. Redding's confession was a sacrifice, meant to draw attention, while Mrs. Protheroe played the grieving widow. But the second pistol, the cigarette, they're mistakes, little threads that unravel the whole. The locked box, too, may hold the motive. Money, or a secret Protheroe held over them." Her voice was calm, but her eyes gleamed with the thrill of the chase. "What now?" I asked, leaning forward. "Slack's ready to haul Anne in, but she'll close up if pressed too hard." "Patience," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking as she resumed her knitting. "Mrs. Protheroe is frightened. Her churchyard meeting with Mr. Redding proves it. Watch her, and Miss Lettice, who sees more than she says. And the box, Mr. Clement. Find a way to it. A discreet inquiry at Old Hall, perhaps through the staff, might reveal its contents." She paused, her smile wry. "The village will do, the rest. Gossip, you see, is a net. It catches what the guilty try to hide." Her counsel was a lifeline, and I left her cottage with a plan. The locked box guarded by Anne was my next target. But first, I needed to gauge the village's reaction to the pistol's discovery. The Blue Boar was the place to start. Its smoky interior, a crucible for St. Mary Mead's theories. As I entered, I was greeted by a chorus of nods, the air thick with ale and speculation. Old Mr. Archer, at his usual table, waved me over, his eyes glinting with news. "Vicar," he said, his voice rough, "they're saying a second gun's turned up, hidden, in your garden. Redding's off the hook, and now they're pointing at Mrs. Protheroe. I saw her myself, you know, near the vicarage that evening. She's in it deep, I reckon." His certainty echoed Slack's, but I pressed for details, hoping to uncover something new. "Did you see anyone else?" I asked. "Near the vicarage, or in the woods?" He scratched his chin, thinking. "Not then, but earlier, around 5. Mrs. Lestrange was about, heading toward her cottage. Looked like she was in a hurry. Queer woman, that one." His mention of Mrs. Lestrange, though vague, was a reminder of her shadow in the case, her argument with Protheroe still unexplained. I lingered at the pub, catching fragments of talk. Mrs. Baker's claim that Anne had burned letters the night of the murder. Miss Weatherby's theory that the second pistol belonged to a hired assassin. Mr. Hawes's nervous mutterings about dark forces in the village. The gossip was a tapestry woven with half-truths, but it pointed to Anne as the fulcrum, her actions scrutinized by eyes she could not escape. Determined to pursue the locked box, I headed to Old Hall, hoping to catch Elsie, the maid, alone. The manor was hushed, its windows reflecting the midday sun. Elsie answered the door, her apron smudged with flour, her eyes wary but curious. "Mrs. Protheroe's out, sir," she said. "Gone to town," she said. "Can I help?" I smiled, keeping my tone light. "Just a small matter, Elsie. You mentioned a brass box in the Colonel's study. Has it been moved or opened that you know of?" She glanced over her shoulder, lowering her voice. "It's still there, sir, on the desk. Mrs. Protheroe keeps the study locked, but I saw her with it yesterday, holding it like it was precious. She caught me looking and snapped at me to mind my work. She's been like that, jumpy, ever since. The police started asking questions." Her words were a goldmine, confirming the box's importance and Anne's protectiveness. "Did you hear what was inside?" I asked, pressing gently. "No, sir," she said, "but it rattled like papers or metal. She's not let anyone near it, not even Miss Lettice." Her mention of Lettice was a spark, reminding me of the girl's resentment and her cryptic hints about Anne's motives. I thanked Elsie and left, the box now a tangible link to the crime. If it held papers, a will, a letter, or evidence of Protheroe's control over Anne, it could explain her fear and Lawrence's sacrifice. But accessing it would require finesse, given Anne's vigilance. I resolved to enlist Lettice, whose candour and grudge against her stepmother might make her an ally. I found Lettice at the village shop, buying ribbon, her red scarf a vivid splash against her pale coat. "Vicar," she said, smirking, "you're relentless. Come to grill me about Anne again." "About the box," I said, lowering my voice. "Elsie says it's still in the study, and Annie's guarding it. You said your father kept papers. Could it be his will or something else?" Her eyes narrowed, a flicker of interest breaking her nonchalance. "Could be. Father was paranoid about his documents, debts, leases, all that. He'd lock them away, especially from Anne. She's probably terrified it'll ruin her perfect widow act." She paused, twirling the ribbon. "I could get you in, you know. Anne is out till evening, and I know where she hides the study key." Her offer was tempting, but I hesitated, wary of crossing ethical lines. "That's generous, Lettice, but I'd rather you just keep an eye on it. If Anne opens it or moves it, let me know." Her smirk widened, as if she enjoyed the intrigue, and I left her, hoping her curiosity would yield results without my direct involvement. Back at the vicarage, Griselda was in the hall, sorting bazaar, donations, her face alight with news. "Len, you'll never guess. Mrs. Baker says Anne was seen burning papers in the manor's garden last night, smoke and all. What if it's from that box?" Her excitement was contagious, but I urged caution, knowing gossip could distort the truth. Determined to test the burning story, I sought Mrs. Baker at the grocer's, where she was stacking tins with vigour. "Vicar," she said, wiping her hands, I saw it myself. Smoke rising from Old Hall's garden late last night. Mrs. Protheroe was there, poking at a fire. Looked like papers from where I stood. She's covering her tracks, I'll wager. Her account, though vivid, was second-hand, and I filed it away, wary of jumping to conclusions. The second pistol, the cigarette, the box, the fire, they were pieces of a mosaic, each sharpening the image of Anne's involvement. But Lawrence's role remained murky, his confession a shield that protected her at his own expense. That evening, I visited Miss Marple, finding her in her parlour, a fire casting warmth across the room. I shared the pistol's discovery, Elsie's account, Lettice's offer, and Mrs. Baker's tale of burning papers, watching her face for insight. She listened, her knitting needles still, her expression one of quiet absorption. "A second pistol," she said, "and a fire in the garden. Mrs. Protheroe is desperate, Mr. Clement. The box holds something she fears, evidence, perhaps, of her motive or her connection to Mr. Redding. The pistol proves the murder was planned, staged to point at Mr. Redding while the real weapon was hidden." "And the firecracker?" I asked, thinking of the charred fragment. "A distraction," she said firmly. "Said to make Mrs. Price Ridley hear a shot at 6:20, while the real shot came earlier, or elsewhere. The cigarette stub places Mrs. Protheroe at the gate, orchestrating it all. She and Mr. Redding are bound, Mr. Clement, not just by love, but by a shared secret. The village sees it in their glances, their silences." She set her knitting aside, her eyes piercing. "Press Miss Lettice gently. She's your key to the box, and watch Mrs. Protheroe's movements. She's nearing a breaking point." I walked home. St. Mary Mead was cloaked in twilight, its lamps flickering like sentinels. The second pistol had cracked the case wide open, revealing a crime of cunning and desperation. Anne's burning papers, the guarded box, Lawrence's faltering confession. They were clues to a truth the village's gossip had sensed all along. Tomorrow I would seek Lettice again, and perhaps, with her help, unlock the secret that bound Anne and Lawrence to Protheroe's death. Chapter 10. The Motive Revealed. The 9th day since Colonel Protheroe's murder dawned with a brittle brightness, the kind that sharpened St. Mary Mead's charm, but underscored its undercurrent of unease. The vicarage, though warmed by Griselda's relentless optimism, felt like a house holding its breath, its walls privy to secrets yet to be unveiled. I, Leonard Clement, woke with a clarity born of sleepless hours. The investigation's pieces, the second pistol, Anne Protheroe's burning papers, the Turkish cigarette stub, and the locked brass box, coalescing into a narrative that pointed inexorably to a conspiracy. Lawrence Redding's confession, now all but discredited, had been a desperate gambit, and the village's gossip, with its relentless focus on Anne's connection to him, was proving more perceptive than I dared hope. Griselda was in the dining room, arranging flowers for the charity bazaar, her hands deft despite her distracted air. "Len," she said, snipping a rose stem, "the village is practically aflame. Mrs. Baker says Anne's selling Old Hall, and Miss Weatherby swears she saw Lawrence's lawyer sneaking about. You must solve this before they start digging up the vicarage garden for more guns." Her jest was light, but her eyes held a flicker of worry, mirroring my own sense that the case was nearing a tipping point. The discovery of the second pistol had shattered Inspector Slack's tidy case against Lawrence, forcing him to reconsider every assumption. The firecracker's charred fragment, the cigarette stub, and Anne's faltering alibi painted a picture of a crime orchestrated with precision, its timeline manipulated to mislead. The locked box, guarded by Anne and hinted at by Lettice, loomed as the key, a repository perhaps of the motive that drove her and Lawrence to act. I resolved to press forward, to uncover the box's contents and confront the truth that St. Mary Mead's watchful eyes had sensed all along. My morning began with a visit to the church, where I hoped the quiet would steady my thoughts. The nave was hushed, its pews empty save for Mr. Hawes, who was arranging hymnals with his usual nervous precision. "Vicar," he said, starting at my approach, "the village is in a state. That second pistol, it's turned everything upside down. They're saying Mrs. Protheroe hid it to frame Redding." His voice trembled, and I wondered if his anxiety stemmed from guilt or merely the village's feverish mood. "Have you heard anything new?" I asked, watching him closely. "About Mrs. Protheroe, or the day of the murder?" He shook his head, his fingers fumbling with a hymnal. "Nothing, sir. I was here, as I said, all evening. Though I did overhear Miss Lettice at the bazaar planning, talking about leaving St. Mary Mead. She sounded desperate, I thought." His mention of Lettice was intriguing, her restlessness a thread I'd yet to fully explore. I thanked him and stepped into the churchyard, where the air was crisp, scented with dew and cut grass. My next move was to seek Lettice, hoping her candour and her grudge against Anne might yield access to the locked box. I found her at the village green, lounging on a bench, her sketchbook open to a half-finished drawing of the church spire. Her red scarf was knotted loosely, and her eyes, when she looked up, held a glint of defiance. "Vicar," she said, closing the book, "you're like a terrier, aren't you? What's it now? More about Anne's secrets." "The brass box," I said, sitting beside her. "You offered to get me into the study. I need to know what's inside, Lettice. The police are circling Anne, and that box might hold the truth about her or your father's death." She tilted her head, a smirk playing on her lips. "You're bold, Vicar. Anne's still out today. Some lawyer meeting, I heard. I could slip you in, but it's risky. She's got the study key hidden in her bedroom behind a mirror. I saw her stash it once." Her willingness was tempting, but her motives were unclear. Was she helping to expose Anne, or settling a personal score? I hesitated, torn between ethics and necessity. "I can't break in," I said, "but if you could check the box yourself, or note if it's been opened, it would help. Your father's papers might explain why he was killed." Lettice shrugged, her smirk fading. "Fine, I'll poke around, but don't expect miracles. Anne's like a dragon with that box. Father always said she was after his money, you know. His will's probably in there, leaving her everything while I get scraps." Her bitterness was raw, and I sensed a deeper wound, one tied to her father's control and Anne's role as his gatekeeper. I left her with a promise to keep her confidence, my mind turning to the will. Protheroe's wealth, tied up in trusts, had been a source of tension, and Lettice's resentment suggested Anne stood to gain significantly. Could the box hold a document that threatened her inheritance, or exposed a secret that Protheroe had used to bind her to him? The motive, I felt, was close, hidden in the manor's shadowed rooms. My next stop was the Blue Boar, where the village's gossip might offer fresh clues. The pub was lively, its tables crowded with locals dissecting the pistol's discovery. Old Mr. Archer, his pint in hand, waved me over. "Vicar," he said, his voice rough, "they're saying that second gun's the real killer. Redding's out on bail now. Slack's got no case, but Mrs. Protheroe's in the hot seat. I heard she was burning papers, night of the murder. Covering her tracks, eh?" The burning papers, first mentioned by Mrs. Baker, were gaining traction, and I pressed for details. "Who saw her?" I asked. "And what kind of papers?" "Mrs. Price Ridley's maid, Clara," he said, leaning close. "Saw smoke in the manor garden late that night. Said Mrs. Protheroe was feeding sheets into a fire. Letters looked like, or documents. Clara's not one for gossip, so it's likely true." His account, more credible than Mrs. Baker's, was a spark, suggesting Anne was destroying evidence, perhaps from the locked box. I lingered at the pub, catching fragments of talk. Miss Weatherby's claim that Anne had withdrawn a large sum from the bank. Mr. Hawes's nervous mutterings about suspicious figures near the manor. Mrs. Baker's theory that the box held a love letter from Lawrence. The village was a chorus, its voices weaving a narrative of Anne's guilt, tempered by wilder fancies that I dismissed. But the burning papers and the box were anchors, grounding the gossip in a reality I could pursue. Determined to confront Anne, I headed to Old Hall, only to find her still absent. Elsie, the maid, greeted me at the door, her eyes wide with nerves. "She's not back yet, sir," she said, twisting her apron. "Been gone all day. Miss Lettice is in, though, if you want her." I declined, wary of alerting Lettice to my urgency, and asked Elsie to pass a message. I needed to speak with Anne about urgent parish matters. It was a pretext, but one that might draw her out. As I walked back to the vicarage, I spotted Miss Marple in her garden, pruning roses with a pair of delicate shears. Her straw hat tilted as she waved me over, her eyes keen despite her gentle smile. "Mr. Clement," she said, "you're deep in the chase, I see. Come inside. I've just baked a batch of scones, and we must discuss this second pistol. Adieu." Parlour was a haven of chintz and warmth, a fire crackling in the grate. Over tea and scones, I shared the day's findings, the pistol's implications, Lettice's offer, the burning papers, and the village's fixation on Anne's inheritance. Miss Marple listened, her knitting needles still, her expression one of quiet absorption. Then, with a clarity that cut through my tangled thoughts, she laid out her theory. "Mrs. Protheroe and Mr. Redding are lovers," she began, her voice steady, not a fleeting passion, but a bond forged in desperation. Colonel Protheroe was a tyrant. His wealth, his control, kept them apart. His fortune, locked in trusts, would pass to Mrs. Protheroe only on his death, and only if she remained his dutiful wife. They saw no way out but murder Mr. Clement. They planned it together, using Mr. Redding's visit to the vicarage as a distraction. She sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving mine. Mrs. Protheroe fired the shot, not in the study, but in a barn near the manor, where no one would hear. She used the second pistol, which she hid later. Mr. Redding staged the study scene, planted. The decoy gun stopped the clock at 6:22 to match their alibis. The firecracker, set by Mrs. Protheroe at the gate, ensured Mrs. Price Ridley heard a shot at 6:20, fixing the false timeline. The cigarette stub was her mistake, left in haste. I stared, her words painting a vivid picture. But Lawrence's confession? I asked. Why sacrifice himself? To protect her, she said. He knew the case against him was weak, smudged, prints no witnesses. He confessed to draw suspicion, giving her time to destroy evidence, like those papers in the garden. But the village, Mr. Clement, is their undoing. Its eyes are everywhere. Mrs. Price Ridley's ear, your nephew's pop, Elsie's glimpses, and the box, it holds the proof, I'd wager. A will, or a letter that Protheroe used to bind Mrs. Protheroe to him, perhaps threatening to disinherit her for infidelity. Her theory was a tapestry, each thread, clock, pistol, firecracker, box, woven into a coherent whole. What now? I asked, my voice hushed. Anne's avoiding me, and the box is locked away. Patience, she said, her smile wry. Mrs. Protheroe is cracking, her burning papers, her absence today. Press Miss Lettice, she's your key to the box, and tell Inspector Slack about the cigarette stub, but gently. He's prickly, but he'll listen. The village will do the rest. Its gossip is a mirror, reflecting what the guilty try to hide. She resumed her knitting, the needles clicking like a metronome, her calm a contrast to the storm in my mind. I left her cottage with a sense of purpose, her theory a map to the truth. The vicarage was quiet when I returned, Griselda in the kitchen, coaxing Mary to bake for the bazaar. I shared Miss Marple's hypothesis, watching her eyes widen. "A barn!" she exclaimed. "Len, that's brilliant. There's an old one near Old Hall, half hidden by trees. You must tell Slack. It could have bloodstains or bullet marks." Her enthusiasm was a spur, and I resolved to visit the barn. But first I needed Lettice's help with the box. I found her at the manor, in the garden, cutting lavender with a pair of shears. "Vicar," she said, smirking, "you're back. Got a warrant yet?" "No warrant," I said, "but a question. Have you checked the box, as you promised? The police are closing in, Lettice, and it might hold the key to your father's death." She sighed, tossing a lavender sprig. I tried, but Anne's got the study bolted like a vault. I did see her with the box last night, though, carrying it to her room, looking like she'd seen a ghost. Whatever's in it, she's terrified of it. Her words were gold, confirming the box's significance and Anne's panic. "Will you keep watching?" I asked. "If she opens it or moves it, let me know." "Fine," she said, "but only because I want Anne squirming. She's not as innocent as she plays, Vicar." Her spite was a tool, one I hoped would unlock the manor's secrets. That afternoon, I visited the barn Griselda had mentioned, a dilapidated structure on the edge of Old Hall's grounds, screened by oaks. The air inside was musty, the floor strewn with hay. I searched for signs, a bullet hole, a bloodstain, but found only dust and cobwebs. Yet the barn's isolation was telling. A shot here would go unheard, its echo swallowed by the trees. I made a mental note to alert Slack, though I doubted he'd search without more evidence. Back at the vicarage, I found a message from Slack, summoning me to the station. He was in his office, his face a mix of irritation and excitement. "Vicar," he said, "we've tested the second pistol. It's the murder weapon. Bullet matches perfectly. Redding's gun was clean, just a prop. And we've got Mrs. Protheroe coming in tomorrow. She's dodging us, but not for long." He leaned forward, his eyes sharp. "You've been sniffing around? Got anything else?" I hesitated, then mentioned the cigarette stub. describing its Turkish brand and its location near the gate. "It might be Mrs. Protheroe's," I said, "and there's talk of her burning papers, documents, possibly from a locked box in the manor." Slack's eyes gleamed. "Good work, Vicar. That's Stubbs' evidence, and burning papers screams guilt. We'll search Old Hall, box and all. Stick around. You might be useful." His grudging respect was a surprise, and I left the station with a sense that the net was tightening. That evening, I returned to Miss Marple, sharing the barn's potential and Slack's plans. She nodded, her knitting a soft rhythm in the firelight. "The barn fits," she said. "A quiet place for a quiet crime. Mrs. Protheroe's burning papers, she's destroying what she can, but the box remains. If Miss Lettice comes through, you'll have your proof. And Mr. Redding, he's the weak link. His love for her will break him, Mr. Clement. Watch them and trust the village. Its whispers are your guide." As I walked home, St. Mary Mead was cloaked in dusk, its lamps glowing like beacons. The motive, love, money, freedom, was clear, its players exposed by the village's relentless gaze. Anne and Lawrence, bound by a desperate plan, had underestimated St. Mary Mead's power, its gossip a mirror to their guilt. Tomorrow, with Lettice's help and Slack's search, the locked box might finally yield its secrets, and the truth of Protheroe's death would stand revealed. Chapter 11. The Confrontation. The 10th day since Colonel Protheroe's murder broke over St. Mary Mead with a restless energy, the village poised on the edge of revelation. The vicarage, though brightened by Griselda's tireless preparations for the charity bazaar, carried a weight of anticipation, its rooms whispering of the secrets that had unravelled within its walls. I, Leonard Clement, woke with a clarity sharpened by Miss Marple's theory. The pieces of the investigation, the second pistol, the Turkish cigarette stub, the firecracker's charred remnant, and the locked brass box, forming a mosaic that pointed to Anne Protheroe and Lawrence Redding as conspirators in a crime of love and desperation. The village's gossip, once a chaotic hum, had crystallized into a truth that could no longer be ignored, and today, I sensed, would bring the climax of our grim drama. Griselda was in the hall, arranging bazaar flyers with a fervour that belied her unease. "Len," she said, pinning a flyer to a notice board, "the village is holding its breath. Mrs. Baker says Anne's been seen pacing the manor at all hours, and Miss Hartnell swears Lawrence is planning to confess again. This time, for real. You must end this before they start accusing me of hiding the killer in the attic." Her jest was light, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of anxiety, echoing my own sense that the net was closing. The second pistol, confirmed as the murder weapon, had demolished Lawrence's confession, revealing it as a shield for Anne. The cigarette stub, the firecracker, and the burning papers pointed to her as the orchestrator, her alibi shattered by Mr. Archer's sighting near the vicarage gate. The locked box, guarded with a ferocity that betrayed its importance, was the final piece. A repository, Miss Marple believed, of a will or secret that had driven Anne and Lawrence to kill. Inspector Slack, now convinced of their guilt, was preparing to search Old Hall, and I resolved to join him, hoping to witness the moment the box yielded its truth. My morning began with a visit to the police station, where Slack was in his office, his sharp features set in a scowl as he reviewed reports. "Vicar," he said, glancing up, "you're just in time. We're heading to Old Hall at noon. Got a warrant to search the study. That box you mentioned and those burnt papers are our focus. Mrs. Protheroe's coming in for questioning, and Redding's meeting us there out on bail. Want to tag along? You've got a nose for this." His invitation, though grudging, was a chance I couldn't miss. "I'll come," I said, "but what about the barn near Old Hall? It might be where the shot was fired. Quiet, hidden, no witnesses." Slack's eyes narrowed. "The barn, eh? Good thought. I'll send a constable to check it later. For due. Now, we nail Mrs. Protheroe. That cigarette stub's got her fingerprints. We tested it this morning. She's cornered, Vicar." His certainty was infectious, and I left the station with a sense of momentum, the case hurtling towards its resolution. Before joining Slack, I sought Miss Marple, needing her insight to steady my nerves. Her cottage was a haven of order, its garden blooming with late roses despite the autumn chill. She was in her parlour, a tray of tea and shortbread biscuits before her, her knitting a soft blue heap in her lap. "Mr. Clement," she said, her eyes twinkling, "you're on the cusp, aren't you? Sit down and tell me everything." I recounted Slack's plans, the fingerprint on the cigarette stub, and my suspicion about the barn. Her expression remained serene, but a spark of satisfaction lit her eyes. "Fingerprints," she murmured, pouring tea. "Or how careless of Mrs. Protheroe. She's unravelling Mr. Clement as I thought. The box will be her downfall. It holds the motive, I'm sure. A will, perhaps, that favoured her only if she remained loyal. Or a letter exposing her affair with Mr. Redding. Colonel Protheroe was a man who hoarded secrets, and she feared their power. And the confrontation?" I asked, sipping the tea. "Slack's ready to pounce, but Anne's so guarded." "She's guarded because she's guilty," Miss Marple said, her voice firm. "But guilt is heavy, Mr. Clement. Mr. Redding's love for her is his weakness. He confessed to protect her, but he'll break under pressure. Watch them together at Old Hall. Their glances, their silences will betray them. And Miss Lettice, has she delivered on the box?" "Not yet," I admitted, "but she's watching Anne. She says Anne moved it to her bedroom, terrified of its contents." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking. "Miss Lettice is your ally, though a prickly one. She wants her stepmother exposed for her own reasons. Be there when the box is opened, Mr. Clement, and trust Inspector Slack to do the rest. The village has done its part. Its eyes, its ears have laid the trap. Now you must spring it." Her calm was a beacon, and I left her cottage with a resolve to see the case through. The noon hour found me at Old Hall, where Slack's motor car was parked, its engine still warm. The manor loomed, its grey stone sombre under a sky streaked with clouds. Slack was at the door, flanked by 2 constables, his warrant in hand. Lawrence Redding was there, pale and haggard, his eyes darting as if expecting an ambush. Anne emerged from the hall, her navy coat buttoned tightly, her face a mask of composure that faltered when she saw Lawrence. "Inspector," she said, her voice steady, "this is unnecessary. I've told you everything." "We'll see about that," Slack said, brushing past her. "We're searching the study and your bedroom, Mrs. Protheroe. That box and any papers are coming with us. Redding, you're here to answer questions. Don't try anything clever." His tone was brusque, and I followed them inside, my heart pounding with anticipation. The study was a grand room, its oak panelling and heavy desk a testament to Protheroe's authority. The brass box was gone, as Lettice had warned, and Slack's scowl deepened. "Where is it?" he demanded, turning to Anne. "Don't play games, Mrs. Protheroe." She hesitated, her hands clenching. "It's in my bedroom," she said at last. "Personal papers, nothing to do with this." Her voice was strained, and I caught a glance between her and Lawrence, fleeting but charged with panic. Slack led us to the bedroom, a spacious chamber with a 4-poster bed and a mirrored dressing table. Behind the mirror, as Lettice had described, was a small key, which Anne reluctantly used to unlock a drawer. Inside was the brass box, its surface gleaming despite a faint dent on one corner. Slack seized it, his eyes glinting. "Open it," he ordered. Anne's hands trembled as she produced a second key, her composure cracking. "It's just papers," she said, her voice barely audible. "My husband's notes, nothing more." She unlocked the box, revealing a stack of documents, letters, ledgers, and a folded sheet sealed with wax. Slack rifled through them, his expression hardening as he unfolded the sealed sheet. "A will," he said, scanning it. "Dated last month. Leaves everything to you, Mrs. Protheroe, provided you remain faithful and obedient. If not, the estate goes to Miss Lettice. Protheroe suspected you, didn't he? Knew about you and Redding." He turned to Lawrence, who stood rigid, his jaw tight. "You knew, didn't you? Helped her get rid of him." Anne's face drained of colour, her hands gripping the dresser. "No," she whispered. We didn't." Her voice broke, and she sank onto a chair, her eyes fixed on Lawrence. Lawrence stepped forward, his voice hoarse. "Leave her alone," he said. "I did it, I told you. I shot him in the study because he was a tyrant. Anne had nothing to do with it." His defiance was fierce, but his eyes betrayed him, lingering on Anne with a desperation that spoke of love and guilt. Slack snorted, unimpressed. "Nice try, Redding, but your gun was a decoy. The real one, hidden in the shrubbery, fired the shot, and her fingerprints are on that cigarette stub, left where she set off a firecracker to fake the shot's time. You're both in this, and this will prove why. Money and freedom from his control." He waved the document, his voice rising. "You staged it, didn't you? Shot him somewhere else, planted the gun and clock, and thought you'd fool us." I glanced at Miss Marple, who had joined us at Slack's request, her presence a quiet anchor in the storm. She stood by the door, her shawl neat, her eyes sharp, as she watched Anne and Lawrence. "Inspector," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "might I suggest you ask Mrs. Protheroe about the barn, the one near the manor, hidden by trees? It's a likely place for the shot, don't you think?" Anne's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. "The barn?" she said, her voice a whisper. I don't know what you mean." But Lawrence broke, his shoulders slumping. "Enough, Anne," he said, his voice raw. "They know. I can't let you carry this." He turned to Slack, his face ashen. "We did it together. Protheroe was going to ruin her, cut her off, expose her. We loved each other, always had. But he trapped her with that will. We planned it, shot him in the barn, late afternoon when no one was near. I carried him to the vicarage, set the clock, planted my gun. Anne lit the firecracker to make it seem the shot was later." Anne sobbed, her hands covering her face. "We had no choice," she cried. "He was cruel, controlling. He'd never let me go. The money was our way out, to start over." Her confession, wrenched from her, was a flood, washing away the last of her defences. Slack's eyes gleamed with triumph. "That's it, then. You're both under arrest. Murder, conspiracy, the lot. We'll check that barn, and I'll bet we find blood." He signalled to the constables who stepped forward, their faces grim. Miss Marple spoke again, her voice soft but piercing. "It's the village, you see," she said, addressing Anne and Lawrence. "You thought you could outwit it with your alibis and props, but St. Mary Mead notices everything. The cigarette you dropped, the smoke in the garden, the glances you shared. You underestimated its eyes, its ears, its heart. Her words were a verdict, delivered with a sadness that tempered their weight." Anne looked at her, tears streaming down her face. "We just wanted to be free," she whispered as the constables led her away. Lawrence followed, his head bowed, his sacrifice complete. I stood in the bedroom, the brass box open on the dresser, its contents a testament to Protheroe's tyranny and the desperation it bred. Slack clapped me on the shoulder, a rare gesture. "Good work, Vicar," he said. "You and that old lady, sharp as tacks, both of you." He gathered the box and its papers, his men escorting Anne and Lawrence to the motor car outside. Secure, Marple and I walked back to the vicarage, the manor fading into the dusk. "A sad business," she said, her shawl tight against the chill. "Love can be a dangerous thing, Mr. Clement, when it's caged by greed or fear. They thought they could escape, but the village held them fast." "You saw it all," I said, marvelling at her insight. "The barn, the firecracker, the box. How did you know?" She smiled, her eyes distant. "People are the same, Mr. Clement, whether in St. Mary Mead or a great city. They lie, they love, they err, and they leave. Traces? I only watched and listened as the village told its story." Her words were a reminder of St. Mary Mead's power, its quiet vigilance, a force no conspirator could outrun. At the vicarage, Griselda was waiting, her face alight with questions. "Len!" she exclaimed, pulling me inside. "Is it true? Anne and Lawrence arrested? Tell me everything." I did over tea, the weight of the day lifting as I recounted the confrontation, Miss Marple's role, and the village's unwitting triumph. St. Mary Mead would talk for weeks, I knew, weaving the tale of Anne and Lawrence into its lore. But, for now, the vicarage was ours again, its shadows dispelled by the truth. I locked the doors that night, grateful for the peace that settled over our home, and for Miss Marple, whose quiet wisdom had illuminated the darkness of a village's heart. Chapter 12. The Quiet of St. Mary Mead. The 11th day since Colonel Protheroe's murder ushered in a stillness to St. Mary Mead, as if the village, exhausted by its fevered speculations and grim revelations, had exhaled at last. The vicarage, cleansed of its role as a crime scene, was slowly reclaiming its warmth, though the memory of that blood-stained study lingered like a faint echo. I, Leonard Clement, woke to a morning bathed in soft light. The weight of the investigation lifted by the arrests of Anne Protheroe and Lawrence Redding, whose conspiracy had unravelled under the village's relentless gaze. Their confessions, wrenched forth in the shadowed rooms of Old Hall, had closed the case, yet left a bittersweet aftertaste, a reminder of love twisted by desperation, and a village's quiet power to expose it. Griselda was in the dining room, arranging a vase of late dahlias, her movements brisk, but her face softened by relief. "Len," she said, tucking a bloom into place, "the village feels different today, doesn't it? Like it's caught its breath. Mrs. Baker's already spinning tales of Anne and Lawrence as doomed lovers, and Miss Hartnell's planning a BY, sermon on moral decay. But I'm just glad it's over." Her smile was infectious, though her eyes held a trace of the strain we'd both endured. The vicarage, for all its charm, had been a battleground, and we were eager to restore its peace. The arrests had sent ripples through St. Mary Mead, each villager claiming a piece of the triumph. The second pistol, hidden in the vicarage shrubbery, had been the key, proving Lawrence's confession a decoy and pointing to Anne's orchestration. The Turkish cigarette stub, the firecracker's charred fragment, and the brass box's contents, a will that chained Anne to Protheroe's control, had woven a narrative of motive and deceit. Miss Marple's theory, delivered with her unerring clarity, had guided us to the truth. A murder planned in a secluded barn, staged in the vicarage, and betrayed by the village's watchful eyes. My morning began with a walk through the village, needing to feel its pulse now that the storm had passed. The high street was a picture of autumnal calm, its cottages glowing with lamplight, the church spire piercing a sky streaked with gold. At the grocer's, Mrs. Baker greeted me with a "Egredatio," knowing nod. "Vicar," she said, stacking apples, "it's a proper end, isn't it? Mrs. Protheroe and that artist caught red-handed. I always said she was too cool, burning those papers like she did. But Miss Marple, sharp as a pin, that one." Her admiration for Miss Marple was universal, the village hailing her as its quiet heroine, though she'd demur with a smile and a wave of her knitting. I continued to the church, where the air was cool and scented with wax. Mr. Hawes, the curate, was there, polishing the brass candlesticks with a steadier hand than I'd seen in days. "Vicar," he said, his voice less tremulous, "it's a relief, isn't it? The village can rest now. Though I heard Miss Lettice is leaving for London. Good riddance, some say. She was always a bit wild." His mention of Lettice was a reminder of her role, her spiteful hints about Anne's secrets unlocking the case's final pieces. I wondered how she'd fare, free of her father's shadow, but carrying the weight of his legacy. Leaving Hawes, I passed the Blue Boar, where old Mr. Archer was outside, puffing on a pipe. "Vicar," he called, his eyes glinting, "quite a show you and Slack put on. That box and Mrs. Protheroe's tears, worthy of a novel. I told you she was near the vicarage that day, didn't I? Never trust a widow who's too calm." "Is she?" Pride in his sighting was palpable, and I nodded, acknowledging the village's collective vigilance. Archer, Mrs. Price Ridley, Dennis, each had contributed a thread to the tapestry Miss Marple had woven. My steps took me to Mrs. Price Ridley's cottage, drawn by a need to thank her for her unwitting role. Her parlour was as cluttered as ever, its shelves groaning with china and faded photographs. She received me with her usual air of command, her black silk dress rustling as she gestured to a chair. "Mr. Clement," she said, her voice rich with satisfaction, "I trust you've come to acknowledge my part in this affair. That shot I heard, well, firecracker or not, it set you on the right path, didn't it? And to think, Mrs. Protheroe, And Reading plotting under our noses. Her indignation was tempered by pride, and I let her revel in it. Her shot a spark that had illuminated the crime's timeline. "You were invaluable," I said, and she beamed, offering me a cup. Of tea I politely declined. As I left, her parting words lingered. "St. Mary Mead's not to be trifled with, Vicar. We see everything." Her boast was true. The village's eyes a net that had ensnared Anne and Lawrence, their every misstep noted by its quiet watchers. I decided to visit Old Hall, curious about Lettuce's plans and the manor's fate. The house was quieter now, its mourning drapes removed, though an air of melancholy clung to its grey stone. Elsie, the maid, answered the door, her apron crisp, but her eyes red-rimmed. "Miss Lettuce is in the garden, sir," she said. "Mrs. Protheroe's gone, of course, and the house feels empty. I'm to stay till it's sold." Her voice held a note of loss, and I wondered how the manor's staff would weather the scandal. Lettuce was pruning roses, her red scarf a vivid splash against her pale dress. She looked up, her smirk softer than usual. "Vicar," she said, snipping a stem, "come to check on the prodigal daughter? I'm off to London tomorrow. Got a job at a gallery, thanks to a friend. No more St. Mary Mead for me." Her tone was defiant, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty, as if the village's pull was stronger than she'd admit. "You played a part in solving this," I said, sitting on a bench. "Your hints about the box, Anne's secrets, they made a difference." She shrugged, tossing a rosebud into a basket. "I just wanted Anne to squirm. Father was a beast, but she played him, didn't she? All for his money and Reading's pretty face. I'm glad she's caught, but I'm done with this place. Too many eyes, too many tongues." Her bitterness was tempered by relief, and I sensed she was eager to shed the weight of her father's name. "What about the will?" I asked, recalling its terms. "You stand to inherit, now that Anne's disqualified." She laughed, a brittle sound. "Oh, that. The lawyers are sorting it, but it's a mess. Trusts, clauses, all father's nonsense. I'll get something, I suppose, but I don't care much. I want a life, Vicar, not a manor." Her candour was refreshing, and I wished her well, hoping London would offer the freedom she craved. As I left Old Hall, the village was settling into its afternoon rhythm, children playing on the green, women chatting over fences. I passed Miss Weatherby at the post office, her eyes gleaming with news. "Vicar," she said, sorting letters, "they're saying the trial will be in Downshire, quick as you like. Anne and Reading pleading guilty, I heard, and that barn, Slack, found bloodstains, just as Miss Marple said." Her excitement was a reminder of the village's thirst for closure, its gossip now a chronicle of triumph. The barn's evidence, confirmed by Slack's team, had sealed the case. A faint bloodstain, hidden under hay, matched Protheroe's type, and a bullet lodged in a beam aligned with the second pistol's calibre. The firecracker, the cigarette, the staged study scene, all had been props in a desperate bid for freedom, undone by St. Mary Mead's unyielding scrutiny. Anne and Lawrence, bound by love and trapped by Protheroe's will, had gambled and lost, their plan no match for the village's quiet wisdom. I resolved to thank Miss Marple, whose insight had been our compass. Her cottage was a haven of roses and lavender, its windows glowing with late sunlight. She was in her parlour, knitting a pale green scarf, a tray of tea and ginger biscuits at her elbow. "Mr. Clement," she said, her smile warm, "you've come to tie up loose ends, I see. Sit down and tell me how St. Mary Mead fares." I recounted the day's events, Lettice's departure, the barn's evidence, the village's relief, watching her face for a reaction. Her eyes twinkled, her needles clicking steadily. "A fitting end," she said, pouring tea. "Mrs. Protheroe and Mr. Redding thought they could outwit us with their firecracker and false gun. But St. Mary Mead is a mirror, Mr. Clement. It reflects what people try to hide. Their love, their fear, their mistakes. It was all there, in the glances we saw, the noises we heard. How did you see it so clearly?" I asked, marvelling at her precision. "The barn, the box, their motive. You knew before we did." She smiled, setting her knitting aside. "I only watched, Mr. Clement, as I always do. People are predictable, you see. They act out of love or greed or despair, and they leave traces. Mrs. Protheroe's cigarette, Mr. Redding's confession, Miss Lettice's spite, they were clues, scattered like breadcrumbs. The village gathered them, and I merely followed the trail." Her modesty was disarming, but her insight was a beacon, illuminating the human heart's complexities. "What now?" I asked, sipping the tea. "The trial will come, but St. Mary Mead, will it heal? Or it will," she said, her voice gentle. "Villages are resilient, Mr. Clement. They gossip, they judge, but they also forgive in time. Miss Lettice will find her way, and Old Hall will have new tenants. As for you and Mrs. Clement, the vicarage is yours again, free of its shadow." She paused, her eyes distant. "But keep watching, Mr. Clement. St. Mary Mead always has another story to tell." Her words were a quiet challenge, and I left her cottage with a renewed appreciation for our village's depth. The vicarage was lively when I returned. Griselda in the drawing-room, teasing Dennis about his cricket scores. "Len!" she exclaimed, pulling me into a chair. "Tell us everything. Lettice, the barn, Miss Marple. I want every detail." I obliged, spinning the tale of the day's quiet victories, the village's role, and Miss Marple's wisdom. Dennis listened wide-eyed, his detective novels forgotten in the face of real drama. As evening fell, I stood at the study window, the room now a place of peace rather than horror. The brass clock, repaired and ticking, marked the hours with a steady rhythm. Outside, St. Mary Mead glowed with lamplight, its cottages a patchwork of lives entwined by habit and history. The murder had tested us, exposing the village's heart, its curiosity, its judgment, its compassion. Anne and Lawrence, their love a tragic footnote, would face justice. Their story a cautionary tale for St. Mary Mead's annals. Griselda joined me, her arm slipping through mine. "It's ours again, isn't it?" she said, her voice soft. "The vicarage, the village, all of it." "It is," I said, squeezing her hand, "thanks to Miss Marple and St. Mary Mead's eyes." She laughed, her curls brushing my shoulder. "Don't let her hear you give her all the credit. She'll blush and blame the village. But you helped, Len, you and your questions. Now promise me no more murders for a while." "I want a quiet winter," I promised, though I knew St. Mary Mead's quiet was never absolute. Its lanes, its gardens, its hearths held stories waiting to unfold, and Miss Marple's knitting needles would be ready when they did. For now, I locked the vicarage doors, grateful for the peace that had returned and for the village that had shown us the way. The stars above St. Mary Mead were bright, and the night, at last, was still.